What if some of the best, healthiest vegetables just disappeared from our plates? Long ago, medieval farmers grew 15 amazing superfoods that most people have forgotten. Let's dig into them and see what we've been missing. First up, Skirit. This superstar root vegetable of the Middle Ages has mysteriously disappeared from modern farming. Unlike today's popular carrots, which demand constant attention, Skirit was the perfect low-maintenance crop. Once planted, these sweet roots quietly multiplied underground, creating a hidden treasure trove of food with almost no effort from farmers. It's like having a savings account that grows vegetables instead of interest. The taste is what made Skirit truly special. Naturally sweeter than carrots or parsnips, these slim white roots were so delicious they earned royal fans. Medieval nobility couldn't get enough of them and demanded Skirit be grown in palace gardens. Talk about a vegetable with a royal fan club. What made Skirit particularly valuable in medieval times was its reliability. During harsh winters when other crops failed, these hardy roots continued providing nourishment. Old farming texts describe them as the comfort of the poor man's table when fields lay barren. Perhaps most impressive is the Skirit's versatility. Medieval cooks roasted them, boiled them, added them to stews, and even made sweet pies with them. They were essentially the medieval equivalent of potatoes before potatoes arrived in Europe. These roots were so useful, they deserved their own coat of arms. But somewhere along the way, this incredible vegetable faded into obscurity. Modern farming favored faster-growing, larger roots. Meanwhile, another forgotten plant was causing quite a stir in medieval gardens. Romans first brought this bold plant to Britain, where medieval farmers quickly fell in love with it. But Alexander's wasn't content staying in neat garden rows. This veggie had the ambition of a weed and the taste of a delicacy. The medieval equivalent of finding out your annoying neighbor is actually a great cook. What made Alexander special? Every single part was edible: stems, leaves, flowers, roots, and seeds. Medieval people ate the young shoots like celery, used the flowers in salads, and ground the seeds as a pepper substitute. The leaves added a strange but pleasant flavor somewhere between parsley and celery to soups and stews. The plant grows up to 6 feet tall with bright yellow flowers that attract beneficial insects. It thrives in coastal areas, cliffs, and roadsides without any human help. It's the freelance vegetable of the plant world, showing up uninvited but doing good work. Despite its usefulness, Alexander's gradually disappeared from our diets. By the 1700s, celery had taken its place in gardens and kitchens across Europe. Today, most people walk past it growing wild without recognizing this once valued food source. While Alexander's boldly spread everywhere, another medieval favorite had a more dignified presence in gardens. Why did one of the most useful plants of the Middle Ages vanish from our gardens? Good King Henry deserves a comeback. Unlike the rebellious Alexanders, Good King Henry starts with a mystery. Nobody knows why it got such a royal name. What we do know is that it was everywhere in medieval Europe, growing both wild and in carefully tended gardens. Growing Good King Henry is about as easy as growing dust on a bookshelf. It practically takes care of itself, sprouting year after year without replanting. If plants could fill out job applications, Good King Henry would list extreme reliability as its top skill. The nutritional value would impress modern health experts. It contains more iron than spinach and high levels of vitamin C, critical nutrients often missing in medieval diets. During spring food shortages, its early leaves provided life-saving nutrition. Medieval cooks used the young shoots like asparagus, mature leaves like spinach, and flower buds like tiny broccoli. It was the medieval version of a 3-in-1 kitchen gadget, except it actually worked. Folk medicine valued Good King Henry too. Its leaves treated wounds while root tea served as a gentle laxative. In some regions, it was called all good because of its many uses. As agriculture became more commercial, this humble but hardy plant fell out of favor. Is it a root? Is it an oyster? Medieval farmers weren't quite sure what to make of salsify. This strange root vegetable has one of the most peculiar flavors in the plant kingdom. Salsify is the vegetable equivalent of someone showing up at a costume party dressed as seafood, only to win the Most Convincing Costume award. When cooked properly, salsify genuinely tastes like oysters. This strange quality made it incredibly valuable during medieval times, especially for religious folks who couldn't eat meat or fish on certain days. Monastery records from the 1400s show it was grown specifically as a fish substitute during Lent. Two types existed in medieval gardens, white salsify and black salsify. Both have long, thin roots with dark skin that must be peeled before cooking. The vegetable world's version of "don't judge a book by its cover." Beneath that ugly exterior hides a gourmet treat. Winter made salsify truly shine. It was one of the few fresh vegetables available during the coldest months, staying in the ground through freezing temperatures. Medieval people would simply dig it up as needed throughout winter. Once harvested, it could be stored for months without spoiling. In a world without refrigeration, this made it extremely valuable. Modern farming moved away from salsify because it grows slowly and looks unusual. Speaking of unusual looks, medieval people had another favorite that modern folks would find truly bizarre. If someone served a wrinkled, mushy fruit today, most people would politely decline. But medieval folks, they considered it a delicacy worth waiting for. The Meddler looks like a small brown apple with an open bottom showing its 5 seeds. Fresh off the tree, it's rock hard and so bitter it's completely inedible. But medieval gardeners knew its secret. Meddlers need to blet before eating. Bletting is basically controlled rotting, where the fruit sits for weeks until it turns soft and brown. Medieval dessert menus were apparently created by people with extremely low standards and incredible patience. Once properly bletted, the Meddler's flesh turns to a sweet cinnamon applesauce consistency that medieval people absolutely loved. Cookbooks from the 1200s contain dozens of recipes for Meddler tarts, jellies, and wines. Unlike salsify, which hid its value beneath an ugly exterior, Meddlers proudly displayed their oddness. The fruit's unusual open-bottom shape earned it some colorful nicknames in medieval times, many too crude to mention here. Let's just say medieval farmers had a particular anatomical comparison in mind and leave it at that. What made Meddlers special was their timing. They ripen in late autumn and were one of the last fresh fruits before winter. After bletting, they could be stored for several more weeks, providing rare sweet treats during the darkest days of the year. Modern agriculture abandoned Meddlers for faster crops with longer shelf lives. Today's consumers want produce that looks perfect immediately, not fruit that needs weeks to become edible. While Meddlers demanded patience, our next forgotten vegetable was almost too eager to please. Unlike the picky Meddler with its need for special treatment, chickweed had no grand history of cultivation. It was simply everywhere. This tiny leaved plant with delicate white flowers popped up in every garden, field, and pathway across medieval Europe. Chickweed is like that uninvited guest who shows up at every party but brings enough food to make everyone happy about it. Medieval gardeners couldn't send out no chickweed invitations that worked. Medieval farmers didn't plant chickweed. They couldn't have stopped it if they tried. It grows in any soil, sprouts in any season above freezing, and produces thousands of seeds from each plant. Instead of just pulling it as a weed, medieval people recognized its value and harvested it for free food. The tender leaves could be gathered year-round in most places. Fresh chickweed contains about 7 times more vitamin C than an equal weight of oranges. If vegetables had medieval job titles, chickweed would have been royal provider of vitamin C when nothing else is growing. Peasants gathered it for everyday meals, but records show that noble households also served it during winter months when green vegetables were scarce. Beyond the dinner table, chickweed had medicinal uses too. Its cooling properties made it useful for skin irritations, and chickweed tea was given for fever and inflammation. Modern agriculture declared war on chickweed with herbicides, labeling this nutritious plant as a nuisance. While chickweed fought for respect, another medieval vegetable suffered from its unfortunate name. No one wants to eat something called Scorzonaraa. Sounds like a disease, doesn't it? Sorry, I can't come to school today. I've got a bad case of Scorzonaraa. Yet this unfortunately named vegetable was a medieval garden staple. The name actually comes from the Italian word scorzone, meaning venomous snake. Early herbalists believed this black-skinned root could cure snake bites. While that medical claim proved false, medieval people discovered something more valuable. Scorzonaraa was delicious and incredibly nutritious. Often confused with black salsify, their close relatives, Scorzonaraa has a longer, straighter root with black skin and white flesh inside. The taste is milder and sweeter than Salifi, with subtle hints of asparagus and nuts. What made Scorzonaraa remarkable was its storage abilities. Harvested in autumn, these roots could be buried in sand in a cool cellar and would stay fresh until the following summer. Few other vegetables offered this kind of food security in medieval times. Cultivation records from the 1500s show Scorzonaraa was especially popular in monastery gardens. The monks valued it for its flavor during fasting periods and its medicinal properties. Medieval doctors prescribed Scorzonaraa tea for purifying blood and calming stomach problems. The best part about growing Scorzonaraa? You can impress your neighbors by casually mentioning, "I'm just heading out to harvest my Scorzonaraa," which makes you sound like you either own an exotic sports car or are about to perform a magic spell. The decline of Scorzonaraa came with modern grocery stores and refrigeration. When fresh produce became available year-round, vegetables that required long storage periods lost their appeal. From magical snake cure to forgotten roots, Scorzonaraa gave way to more familiar vegetables. Oddly enough, Welsh onions are neither from Wales nor are they true onions. They're the medieval vegetable version of those fake designer products that somehow work better than the real thing. The actual origin of Welsh onions is East Asia, likely reaching Europe through trade routes around the 1200s. Medieval farmers appreciated this versatile plant that provided fresh greens year after year. What made them special? They're perennial, meaning once planted, they return year after year without replanting. Each plant gradually multiplies, forming clumps that can be divided. One medieval gardening text claims a single Welsh onion plant could feed a family for 10 years through constant division. Welsh onions served a purely practical purpose, providing a steady supply of fresh green onion tops when other vegetables were scarce. Medieval cooks used the hollow green shoots to flavor soups, stews, and salads. The most valuable feature was their winter hardiness. In many regions of Europe, Welsh onions stayed green through all but the harshest winters, providing crucial vitamins during the leanest months. Welsh onions might be the only food that solved an identity crisis by having an identity crisis of its own. Not Welsh, not a true onion, yet perfectly comfortable being exactly what it is. Medieval farmers treasured these reliable plants, but modern agriculture favored true onions for their larger bulbs. Meanwhile, another misunderstood plant was fighting for recognition. Unlike Welsh onions that medieval farmers deliberately planted, fat hen just showed up. This wild green volunteered in fields, gardens, and waste places throughout Europe, and medieval people were smart enough to eat it instead of just pulling it out. Fat hen is basically the uninvited dinner guest who turns out to be a master chef. It crashed the medieval garden party, but brought enough nutritional gifts that everyone forgave the intrusion. Recent studies have revealed just how nutritious this weed truly is. Fat hen contains more protein than cabbage, more iron than spinach, and more calcium than kale. Had medieval nutritionists existed, they would have classified fat hen as a superfood. The name comes from its effectiveness as poultry feed. Chickens that eat fat hen produce more eggs and grow plumper. If medieval vegetables had marketing slogans, fat hens would be good enough for your chickens, even better for you. Archaeological digs have uncovered countless fat hen seeds in food waste pits, showing it was regularly eaten. During famines, this wild plant often meant the difference between starvation and survival. Cooking methods varied across Europe. The leaves were boiled like spinach or added to salads, while the seeds were ground into flour during hard times. Modern farming declared war on fat hen, considering it a competitor to crops. We essentially kicked a superfood out of our diet because it didn't fill out the proper application to be considered a vegetable. While fat hen struggled for recognition, another herb was fighting to maintain its culinary status. Why did a herb that could flavor everything just disappear from our kitchen gardens? Unlike fat hen, which never got proper recognition, lovage was a culinary superstar that mysteriously faded away. Roman soldiers carried lovage seeds as they conquered Europe, planting this powerful herb wherever they settled. Medieval monks continued the tradition, ensuring every monastery garden had a lovage plant. The flavor is intense. Imagine celery mixed with parsley, but multiplied by 10. Lovage is basically celery with superpowers. It's what celery would be if it started working out and got really serious about flavor. Medieval cooks used lovage extensively. One sprig could flavor an entire pot of soup. The dried leaves were sprinkled on the meat dishes. The seeds were crushed for bread. Even the roots were boiled and eaten like parsnips. Most impressively, the hollow stems were candied as sweet treats. What made lovage truly valuable in medieval times was its medicinal uses. The entire plant contains oils that aid digestion, reduce bloating, and act as a mild diuretic. Monastery records from the 13th century describe lovage tea as a remedy for troubles of the stomach and kidney complaints. A lovage plant can live for 20 years and grow over 6 feet tall, providing a tremendous amount of flavor from very little garden space. It's also incredibly hardy, surviving harsh winters and returning vigorously each spring. Medieval gardeners must have thought modern gardeners lost their minds. You're telling me you stopped growing a plant that flavors everything, lives for decades, and helps with digestion? Did you replace your brains with turnips? As international trade brought new spices to Europe, lovage gradually lost its prominence. While lovage faded away, another forgotten green faced its own challenges with a very confusing name. No, it has nothing to do with corn. This unfortunate naming confusion has plagued corn salad for centuries. While lovage suffered from being forgotten, corn salad suffered from being misunderstood. Corn salad gets its strange name from where it typically grows, in fields of grain, which Europeans called corn long before maize arrived from America. These small, tender greens pop up naturally in autumn after grain harvests and stay green through winter. It's like the quiet kid in class who gets overlooked because of a weird nickname but turns out to be the most interesting person there. Medieval farmers discovered these wild winter greens were not only edible, but delicious. Corn salad has a mild, slightly nutty flavor with none of the bitterness found in many wild greens. The leaves can be harvested throughout the coldest months when nothing else is growing. The nutritional profile would impress modern health experts. It contains 3 times more omega-3 fatty acids than iceberg lettuce and significant amounts of iron and vitamin C. Medieval people recognized its value as a fresh winter vegetable. Corn salad has to be the only vegetable that suffered from both an identity crisis and a public relations problem. It needed a medieval marketing team to clarify contains absolutely no corn. Modern agriculture favored lettuce varieties with longer shelf lives and easier harvesting. As corn salad faded from gardens, another bold-flavored medieval plant rejection for being simply too intense for modern tastes. Too intense for modern tastes? That's the story of Tanzy, a plant that medieval cooks couldn't live without, but modern people have almost completely abandoned. Tanzy grows as a bushy perennial with fern-like leaves and bright yellow button flowers. Every part of the plant packs a powerful aromatic punch, a complex mix of bitter, spicy, and slightly sweet flavors that medieval taste buds craved. Modern chemical analysis has identified over 40 different flavor compounds in tansy leaves. If herbs were rock bands, tansy would be the one that plays so loud the neighbors call the police. Medieval cookbooks feature tansy in everything from savory dishes to desserts. The Easter specialty, tansy pudding, combined the chopped leaves with eggs, cream, breadcrumbs, and sugar, then fried the mixture into a cake. Tansy-flavored cheese was popular in spring celebrations, and even ale was infused with tansy for special occasions. Beyond its bold flavor, tansy served a practical purpose in medieval cuisine. Its powerful compounds work as a natural preservative, extending the shelf life of meats and baked goods. This was invaluable in an era without refrigeration. The plant also played a crucial role in medieval medicine. Tansy tea was used to treat intestinal worms, digestive issues, and fever. Monastery gardens always included tansy for both culinary and medicinal purposes, often planting it near doorways where its strong scent could repel flies and other insects. Modern chefs would probably describe tansy as aggressively aromatic, the medieval equivalent of using all caps in your seasoning. As milder herbs like parsley became more popular, tansy gradually lost its place in kitchens. While tansy fell out of favor for being too bold, another forgotten vegetable suffered the opposite fate. It grows wild. It requires zero maintenance, and yet we somehow forgot all about it. While tansy was too bold, sea kale was too easy to overlook. Growing along coastal areas of northern Europe, sea kale was a valuable food source for medieval communities. This hardy plant thrives in sandy, salty soil where few other edible plants can survive. Sea kale is like that friend who brings food to every gathering without being asked, yet somehow never gets invited to the cool parties. Medieval people harvested it two ways: blanched young shoots in spring, similar to asparagus, and matured leaves later, cooked like cabbage. Unlike many wild foods, sea kale is mild and sweet tasting. What made it especially valuable was its vitamin C content, 6 times higher than lemons by weight. For fishing communities with limited access to fresh produce, sea kale prevented scurvy. The disappearance of sea kale from our diet is like forgetting how to accept free money. It's literally sitting there on beaches, being delicious and nutritious while we ignore it. As sea kale faded into obscurity, another unusual plant was struggling with its dual identity. This one is truly weird. Woad was primarily grown for making blue dye, but medieval people also ate it. Unlike sea kale, which was purely for nutrition, woad lived a double life. The blue pigment from woad leaves colored everything from clothing to warrior paint. Before woad, trying to find blue clothing was like trying to find a quiet moment at a toddler's birthday party. Theoretically possible, but highly unlikely. What's strange is that young woad leaves are perfectly edible before they develop their dyeing compounds. Medieval farmers harvested these tender first leaves for spring salads and soups. The flavor is mild with a slight peppery kick, similar to young mustard greens. Growing woad was a smelly business. The process of extracting blue dye involved fermenting the leaves, creating such a terrible stench that royal decrees banned woad processing near important residences. It was the medieval equivalent of that one weird food that makes your whole kitchen smell for days. While woad struggled with its identity as both food and dye, another humble vegetable part was being overlooked. While woad struggled with its split personality, turnips suffered from people ignoring half their goodness. Everyone knows turnips, those humble root vegetables that fed countless medieval peasants. What most people don't realize is that medieval farmers valued the leafy green tops just as much as the roots below. It's like buying a smartphone and only using it to tell time. You're missing out on the best features. Turnip greens contain 4 times more calcium, 3 times more vitamin A, and twice the protein of the roots. Medieval peasants carefully harvested the outer leaves throughout the growing season without damaging the developing root. These greens were a staple in medieval soups, stews, and salads, adding their slightly peppery flavor to otherwise bland winter meals. Turnip greens deserve a comeback tour. They've been backstage too long while the roots get all the applause. From Skirit to turnip greens, these 15 forgotten vegetables show how much knowledge we've lost about food that once sustained our ancestors. These 15 cheap meals weren't fancy, but they kept generations fed through plague, famine, and endless hard work. And at the top of that list, pottage. Ever had a house guest who just wouldn't leave? That's basically what pottage was to medieval peasants, except they actually wanted it to stick around. This legendary soup was the ultimate waste not, want not dish of the Middle Ages, simmering endlessly over the fire like the world's most patient dinner. Pottage wasn't just any soup, it was the soup, the cornerstone of medieval peasant nutrition and the original set it and forget it meal. Unlike our modern quick dinners that disappear after one sitting, pottage was a deliberate lifestyle, a practical solution to the harsh realities of medieval life. At its core, pottage was simply a thick, hearty stew that stayed alive for days or even weeks. The cooking pot rarely left the hearth, with new ingredients tossed in as others were eaten, the medieval version of a never-ending buffet, but with considerably fewer options and much less variety. What went into pottage? The better question is what didn't. The base typically consisted of whatever grain was cheapest and most available, barley, oats, or rye, boiled until it broke down into a thick porridge-like consistency. From there, peasants added whatever vegetables they could get their hands on: turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage, and if they were lucky, carrots or peas. One study of medieval food remains found that the average peasant household kept their pottage going for at least 4 days before starting fresh, though many families maintained their pot for much longer. During lean winter months, archaeological evidence from medieval village sites shows that pottage ingredients became increasingly limited, often reduced to just grains and root vegetables. While all social classes ate some version of pottage, there was a world of difference between peasant pottage and what bubbled in noble kitchens. Wealthy households enhanced their pottage with expensive imported spices, bits of meat, and even wine. Meanwhile, peasant pottage relied on local herbs for flavor: garlic, parsley, sage, or whatever grew nearby. On special occasions or after a successful hunt, a peasant family might drop a small piece of salt pork or bacon into their pottage pot. Not enough to make a meal of meat, but just enough to infuse the entire pot with flavor. The fat would rise to the top, providing precious calories during hard times. Some historians believe medieval peasants consumed as much as 2 to 3 pints of pottage daily, making it the true fuel of the feudal system. Not exactly a meal worth posting on social media, but it kept countless generations alive through centuries of hardship. Pottage may have been the never-ending soup of medieval times, but it wasn't the only thing that kept peasants on their feet. Bread connects us all. From ancient times to modern kitchens, it remains the world's most universal food. But the loaves that graced medieval peasant tables would make most of us today turn up our noses. Forget fluffy white bread or artisanal sourdough. Medieval peasant bread was dark, dense, and often as hard as the lives of those who ate it. Made primarily from rye or barley, grains that grew in poor soil where wheat struggled, these loaves bore little resemblance to what we call bread today. The grain for peasant bread wasn't just different. The entire process was. First, the grain was often of poor quality. The best wheat went to nobles and clergy who could afford it. Second, peasants paid hefty fees to have their grain ground at the Lord's mill. To save on these costs, many would mix in fillers: ground peas, beans, acorns, chestnuts, and in desperate times, ground tree bark or straw. How much bread did the average peasant eat? The numbers are staggering. Records from medieval England show that a working man might consume 2 or 3 pounds of bread daily, providing over 60% of their total calories. Women and children ate proportionally similar amounts. This wasn't gluttony. Heavy labor in the fields required massive caloric intake, and bread delivered those calories cheaply. The baking process itself revealed the stark class divisions of medieval society. Wealthy households enjoyed fresh bread daily. Peasants, lacking private ovens, typically baked just once a week in communal village ovens or fashioned flat breads that could cook on simple hearthstones. These weekly loaves grew progressively harder and moldier as the days passed, requiring a dunk in pottage or ale to become edible again by week's end. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of medieval bread was the potential for poison. Rye, the peasant grain of choice in many regions, was susceptible to ergot fungus, a naturally occurring hallucinogen containing compounds similar to LSD. Entire villages sometimes experienced mass hallucinations, convulsions, and even death from what was called St. Anthony's fire. What they couldn't know was that their daily bread was to blame. Yet for all its dangers and deficiencies, bread was sacred in medieval culture. Stealing bread was punished severely, wasting it considered sinful. The medieval table began with bread and ended with bread. When famine struck, as it regularly did, families might survive for weeks on bread alone, though the definition of bread became increasingly creative. The dark, dense loaves that fueled medieval labor rarely came with accompaniments. But when peasants were lucky enough to have something to put on their bread, it was often something simple that required little preparation after a long day working the fields. In medieval cuisine, the answer was gruel, essentially one step above consuming boiled water with a spoon. When bread became scarce and pottage ingredients ran low, gruel stepped in as the final defense against an empty stomach. "Please, sir, I want some more," might be the famous literary line associated with gruel, but medieval peasants rarely had the luxury of seconds. Gruel was survival food, plain and simple. Made by boiling a small amount of grain in a large amount of water, it stretched minimal ingredients to their absolute limit. The recipe, if you could call it that, couldn't be simpler. Take oats, barley, or whatever grain scraps remained in the bottom of the storage bin, add water until the mixture looked desperately thin, then cook until it resembled something edible. If you were particularly fortunate, you might have a pinch of salt to add. The result? A watery, bland substance that filled the belly without satisfying any other human desire. Gruel differed from pottage in its deliberate thinness and from porridge in its sad lack of substance. Medieval records indicate that during the harshest famines, monasteries feeding the poor would stretch a single cup of oats into gruel that served 10 people. The mathematician in the room might observe that this works out to less than 2 tablespoons of grain per person, hardly a meal by any standard. Interestingly, gruel wasn't just for the desperately poor. Monks across medieval Europe regularly consumed gruel as part of their religious practice. Monastery kitchen records from the 12th century show that monks ate gruel during fasting periods, with one abbey documenting consumption of gruel twice daily during Lent. Their bowls might occasionally include honey or dried fruit, luxuries ordinary peasants could only dream about. For the sick and elderly, gruel became medieval health care. Those too ill to chew bread or too weak to digest heartier foods were fed gruel until they recovered. Or didn't. Medieval medical texts recommend gruel for ailments ranging from fever to toothache, suggesting additions like herbs or wine for medicinal purposes. Of course, peasants rarely had access to such fancy versions. Children weaning from breast milk often transitioned directly to gruel, creating generations of Europeans who never knew the concept of baby food. Court records from medieval England occasionally mention children who died of malnutrition despite being fed gruel regularly, a grim reminder of its nutritional inadequacy. The taste? About what you'd expect. Contemporary accounts describe it as thin, watery, and occasionally slimy, hardly a ringing endorsement. One medieval writer noted that even the dogs turn from it unless truly starving, which tells you everything you need to know. When even gruel became too luxurious due to grain shortages, medieval peasants turned to another reliable crop that thrived in poor soil and stored through winter. Turnips, the forgotten vegetable of modern cuisine, once reigned supreme in medieval kitchens. While today's shoppers might pass them by without a second glance, these humble roots kept countless peasants alive through centuries of hardship. What made turnips so essential to medieval survival? First, they grew almost anywhere. Poor soil, turnips thrived. Short growing season, turnips managed. Little attention from busy farmers, turnips forgave the neglect. A single turnip seed could yield up to 15 pounds of food, making them among the most efficient crops a peasant could plant. Turnip stew became the medieval equivalent of fast food, quick, filling, and available year-round. The basic recipe required minimal effort. Chop turnips, add water, boil until soft, season with salt if available. That's it. No fancy techniques, no rare ingredients, just pure sustenance. Storage was another turnip superpower. Long before refrigeration, medieval peasants stored turnips in cool, dry cellars where they remained edible for months. Some villages dug specialized turnip pits, essentially underground storage chambers lined with straw, where turnips kept fresh from harvest until late spring. Records from one English manor in 1286 noted that turnips stored this way fed village families for 7 months after harvest. Unlike many vegetables, the entire turnip was edible. Roots went into stews, leaves were added to pottage, and even the flowers could be eaten in spring. Nothing went to waste. Medieval field records suggest that a family of 4 needed to grow about 200 pounds of turnips to survive winter, a goal achievable in a surprisingly small garden plot. The humble turnip even played a role in medieval medicine. Folk healers prescribed turnip juice for coughs and turnip poultices for skin ailments. One monastery medical text claims turnips drive away winter melancholy, perhaps an early recognition of the nutritional benefits of fresh vegetables during vitamin-scarce winter months. Of course, eating turnips day after day had its downsides. Medieval writers occasionally complained about the sameness of peasant meals, with one noting that the poor eat turnips until their skin takes on the pallor of the root itself. Another drawback was less aesthetic and more aromatic. Turnips, especially when reheated repeatedly, developed a distinctive smell that permeated medieval homes. For all their benefits, turnips weren't exactly celebration food. When asked what feast he would prepare if suddenly wealthy, a medieval peasant reportedly answered, "The same turnips, but with meat." This humble aspiration speaks volumes about medieval culinary reality. While turnips may have dominated the medieval table, they rarely appeared alone. Another vegetable duo frequently joined them, creating a trio of flavors that, while simple, offered both nutrition and a welcome break from turnip monotony. Could 2 vegetables clear a medieval peasant hut faster than the plague? Cabbage and onions certainly tried their best. This odorous duo formed the backbone of peasant cooking across Europe, adding much-needed flavor to otherwise bland meals while simultaneously testing the limits of medieval ventilation. Cabbage earned its spot in peasant gardens by being super useful. A single cabbage plant could grow very big, with heads weighing up to 15 pounds. Old farm records show that 10 cabbage plants could feed a family for months, taking up very little garden space. The outer leaves could be picked throughout the growing season, while the middle kept growing, like food that replaced itself as you ate it. Saving cabbage made it truly valuable. Fresh cabbage lasted weeks in cool storage, but soured cabbage, what we now call sauerkraut, kept for months. Diggers found old cabbage pits in medieval villages where people let cabbage sour. One dug-up pit from a 1300s village had leftover bits from over 100 cabbages saved together, enough to feed several families all winter. Onions worked perfectly with cabbage in old-time cooking. Tough and hard to kill, they grew in the worst dirt and stored without any special tools. Old garden books told people to plant onions around other crops to keep bugs away, making them twice as useful in small peasant gardens where every bit of space mattered. Together, these veggies turned plain food into something with real taste. Boiled together, they made a simple side dish. Added to soup, they gave more flavor. Mixed with tiny bits of meat, they became a feast. Old tax records sometimes list cabbage and onions as okay payment for small debts, showing how much people valued them every day. The belly troubles from these veggies were well known back then. Old court records from many villages talk about problems caused by the too much gas after cabbage meals. One rule in a monastery banned cabbage on days when monks had important visitors, hinting that the farts afterward weren't good for polite company. Oddly enough, old-time doctors didn't trust veggies. Rich people's doctors often warned nobles not to eat poor people plants like cabbage, saying they made you sad and slow thinking. Meanwhile, the poor folks eating these veggies every day lived on much less food than the rich, and probably had fewer of the food-related illnesses that rich people often got. For all their benefits, cabbage and onions couldn't supply everything a hard-working peasant needed. A diet with only these vegetables, even with bread and pottage, didn't have enough protein. Medieval peasants knew this by instinct, if not by science, which led them to seek protein wherever they could find it. Medieval folks didn't have protein shakes, but they did have mushy peas and beans. These humble crops were the everyday heroes of the peasant diet, providing the strength needed for long days of hard work in the fields. Peas and beans offered what bread and cabbage couldn't: real protein. Dried peas contained about 25% protein by weight, making them worth their weight in gold during winter months when meat was scarce or gone completely. A small patch of peas could yield up to 60 pounds of dried peas, enough to help a family through the leanest months. Growing these protein-packed foods was simple enough, even for the worst farmers. Peas and beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, which meant they could grow in fields where other crops had used up all the good stuff. Smart peasants planted peas and beans between rows of other veggies, or after harvesting grain, getting extra food from the same patch of land. The most common way to eat peas and beans was mashed. After soaking dried peas or beans overnight, peasants boiled them until soft, then mashed them into a thick paste. Salt was added if available, and maybe wild herbs if they were lucky. The result looked a bit like baby food, but packed a nutritional punch that kept workers going through 12-hour workdays. During the harshest times, pea and bean mash became the main meal rather than a side dish. Old records from one English village during the famine of 1315 note that families survived for weeks on nothing but pea mash and small beer, with bread becoming a luxury. Monks across Europe relied heavily on these humble foods. Church rules banned meat on many days of the year, sometimes more than half the calendar, making peas and beans vital to monastery kitchens. Count books from a large abbey show they stocked over 3,000 pounds of dried peas yearly for just 40 monks. That's 75 pounds per monk. Storage was another big plus. While fresh peas and beans lasted only days, the dried versions kept for years if stored right. Peasant homes often had clay pots or wooden barrels of dried legumes tucked away as insurance against bad harvests. One dig at a peasant home found peas still in storage pots from 10 years earlier, still edible if not exactly tasty. The downside? Same as cabbage, these foods cause gas. Medieval health guides warned against eating too many beans before church services or court appearances. One old joke told of a bean farmer who couldn't sell his crop because he'd tested too much of his product on the way to market. While peas and beans kept peasants alive and healthy enough to work, they weren't exactly exciting to eat day after day. Medieval peasants still craved variety in their meals. Whenever they had the chance to add something different to their cooking pots, they jumped at the opportunity. And sometimes that opportunity came from surprising sources. Eat what you can get. This was the golden rule of medieval meat eating for the poor. While nobles dined on roasted venison and fat capons, peasants made do with the bits nobody else wanted: the organs, feet, heads, and odd scraps that today we call offal. Animal butchering in medieval times followed strict rules about who got what parts. The lord of the manor claimed the best cuts: the tenderloins, plump breasts, and meaty haunches. Town folks with money bought the decent middle-grade pieces. What remained for peasants? Everything else. But medieval peasants were masters at turning these scraps into food worth eating. Take the humble pig head. After a pig slaughter, peasant families often received the head as partial payment for their work. Nothing went unused. The cheeks provided small but tender meat portions. The ears were cleaned, sliced, and fried crisp. The snout and lips went into jellied dishes. Even the brain was scooped out and scrambled like eggs. Larger animals provided even more awful options. Cow stomachs cleaned and boiled became the container for haggis-like mixtures of grain and bits of heart or liver. Sheep lungs, sliced thin and fried with onions, offered a quick meal after butchering day. Blood from any animal became blood pudding when mixed with grain and cooked in a cleaned intestine casing. Game animals too small for the lord's table often ended up in peasant cooking pots whole. Squirrels, hedgehogs, and even rats in desperate times provided tiny portions of meat that flavored otherwise plain vegetable dishes. Records from one medieval village during a harsh winter mention peasants trapping and eating badgers, foxes, and other animals typically considered inedible. The unwritten rule was simple: if it couldn't kill you, it was food. This waste-nothing approach stretched tiny amounts of animal protein to feed many mouths. A single cow's organs could provide meals for several families, while the prime cuts fed just one noble household for a day or two. Court records reveal how valuable these scraps were. Theft of offal was punished severely, sometimes with the same penalties as stealing more valuable cuts. One medieval English town recorded finding a man for stealing a sheep's pluck, the heart, liver, and lungs, equal to 2 weeks' wages. Preservation techniques for offal were necessarily quick. Without refrigeration, organs spoiled rapidly. Smoking, salting, and immediate cooking were the only options. Many offal dishes became linked to butchering days, eaten within hours of the animal's slaughter in an almost ceremonial feast. For people living near coasts or rivers, another source of protein swam within reach. Medieval folks didn't have drive-thrus, but they did have salted herring, the original grab-and-go meal. These preserved fish were the fast food of the Middle Ages, ready to eat without cooking and packed with enough salt to make you thirsty for days. Herring became the fish of choice for medieval peasants for 3 simple reasons. They swam in huge groups, were easy to catch, and could be preserved with simple salt. Fishing records from medieval times show just how massive the herring industry was. During peak season, a single fishing fleet from Great Yarmouth in England could haul in more than 40 million herring in just a few weeks. That's enough fish to give every person in medieval England 7 fish each. The salt preservation process was quick but smelly work. Fresh herring spoiled within a day, so fishing boats often carried salt on board. Workers gutted the fish, packed them in heavy salt, and stored them in wooden barrels right on the deck. The smell was so strong that herring processing areas of medieval towns had their own districts, safely downwind from where most people lived. For peasants, salted herring became the answer to many food problems. First, it solved the meat ban during religious fasting days. The church banned meat on Fridays during Lent and on many other holy days, sometimes totaling more than half the year. Fish remained allowed, making herring a crucial protein source for those times. Second, herring could travel far from the coast without spoiling. Packed in barrels, these fish reached deep inland where fresh fish never could. Trade records show barrels of herring moving hundreds of miles from the sea, reaching mountain villages and remote farms. Third, no cooking needed. While fresh herring required cooking, the heavily salted version could be eaten as is, a medieval version of ready-to-eat food. For busy peasants working from dawn to dusk, a quick meal of herring and bread saved precious time and fuel. The cheapest herring came white, simply gutted and salted. Those with a bit more money might buy red herring, which were salted and then smoked for days until they turned a reddish-brown color and lasted even longer. The smoking process made them less salty and gave them a stronger flavor that some preferred. Just how many herring did medieval Europeans eat? Tax records tell an amazing story. The small Baltic island of Scania processed more than 300 million herring annually in peak years. A single monastery in York bought 15,000 herring yearly to feed just 30 monks. That's 500 fish per monk per year, or more than one herring every single day. Of course, eating fish day after day got boring fast. Medieval cooks found ways to make herring more interesting, chopping them into spreads, adding them to pies, or soaking them to remove salt before cooking. But no matter how they prepared it, herring breath remained an occupational hazard of being medieval. After a salty meal, medieval peasants needed something to wash it down with, and their drink of choice wasn't water. Water in medieval times could be deadly. Wells were often dug too close to outhouses, rivers caught sewage from upstream towns, and most people had no idea that dirty water could make you sick. They just knew that people who drank from certain water sources often fell ill, while those who stuck to ale stayed healthy. The brewing process accidentally solved this problem. Boiling the water for brewing killed harmful germs, and the alcohol helped prevent new ones from growing. Medieval people didn't understand the science, but they saw the results clearly enough. Ale drinkers were healthier than water drinkers. Ale in medieval times wasn't the strong stuff we think of today. Small ale or small beer contained just enough alcohol to preserve it, about 1 to 3%, similar to modern light beer. This weak brew was an everyday drink for everyone, including children. Yes, medieval kids drank ale with breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but they weren't stumbling around drunk. It was more like drinking very flavorful water. How much ale did the average person drink? Medieval records tell an amazing story. Many adult workers received ale allowances of a gallon per day. That's 8 pints. Manor records show that during harvest time, when work was hardest, this might increase to a gallon and a half. No wonder medieval workers took so many breaks during the day. They had a lot of liquid to process. Brewing was usually women's work, done right at home. The basic recipe was simple. Heat water, add malted grain, strain out the grain, add flavor with herbs, then let it ferment. Most women brewed once or twice a week, making the family supply in wooden tubs before storing it in pottery jugs or wooden barrels. Ale spoiled quickly without refrigeration, usually within a week. This meant it was truly a local food, made and consumed within the same community. It also meant brewing was a constant chore for medieval households, as necessary and regular as making bread. Speaking of bread, ale and bread were intimate partners in medieval kitchens. Both needed grain, both used yeast for fermentation, and many households made them together on brewing day. Leftover ale could be used in bread dough, while bits of bread could start the fermentation for the next ale batch. Nothing went to waste. Ale even served as payment. Medieval work records show that many tasks were rewarded with both money and ale. Building a section of village wall might earn you 3 pence plus 2 gallons of ale. Church bell ringers often received payment in ale rather than coins. One English village paid its rat catcher with a weekly jug, perhaps to help him forget what he did all day. For special occasions and celebrations, peasants might enjoy stronger drinks with more flavor and kick. The contrast between medieval peasants sipping cider and today's folks buying expensive drinks couldn't be more striking. While cider and mead were treats for the poor, they weren't luxury items, but practical solutions to food storage problems and rare sources of sweetness in an otherwise bland diet. Cider became the drink of choice in areas where apples grew well. Apple trees had major advantages for peasant farmers. Once planted, they produced fruit for decades with minimal care. Even better, they could grow on hillsides too steep for regular crops, making use of otherwise wasted land. In parts of England, France, and Spain, almost every peasant household had rights to at least a few apple trees. Making cider involved simple tools and basic steps. Peasants collected apples, crushed them in wooden presses, collected the juice, and left it to ferment naturally. The wild yeasts on apple skins started fermentation without any extra help. After a few weeks, the sweet juice transformed into a mildly alcoholic drink that could keep for months, much longer than the apples themselves would have lasted. Strong cider contained about 4 to 8% alcohol, enough to feel good after a few cups, but not so strong that workers couldn't function the next day. Weaker versions were everyday drinks, while the stronger batches were saved for special occasions like weddings and harvest festivals. Mead offered an even sweeter escape from daily troubles. Made by fermenting honey with water, mead was the oldest known alcoholic drink in Europe. However, honey was expensive and hard to get, making mead much rarer than ale or cider for average peasants. Most peasants only tasted mead a few times a year, usually at Christmas, Easter, or when celebrating weddings. Some clever peasants kept their own beehives, providing honey for both sweetening food and making small batches of mead. A single hive could produce 15 to 20 pounds of honey yearly, enough for a family to make a few gallons of mead and still have honey for other uses. Both cider and mead served important practical purposes beyond just tasting good. The alcohol helped preserve the natural sugars in apples and honey far longer than they would have lasted otherwise. In an age without refrigeration, turning sweet things into alcohol was a smart storage solution. Medieval kitchen records showed that cider could last 6 months to a year if stored in cool cellars, while properly made mead could last several years. These sweet drinks also provided valuable calories during hard times. When bread supplies ran low, a cup of cider or mead delivered quick energy. Records from one English village during a food shortage mention adults drinking cider as a meal replacement when grain supplies dwindled. Speaking of sweetness, while honey made mead possible, it also served many other purposes in medieval kitchens, joining forces with other rare sweet treats. Sugar wasn't something most medieval peasants ever tasted. This expensive import remained firmly in the realm of the wealthy, who used it both as food and medicine. For the common folk, sweetness came directly from nature in the form of honey and wild berries, treats that brightened an otherwise dull diet. Honey stood as the king of sweeteners in the medieval world. Unlike sugar, it could be produced locally, though not without risk and effort. Brave peasants gathered wild honey by following bees to their hives, smoking them to reduce stinging, and cutting out honeycomb chunks. This dangerous work often resulted in multiple stings, but yielded liquid gold that made the pain worthwhile. Some clever peasants took beekeeping a step further. Old farming guides describe simple beehives made from hollow logs, straw skeps, or clay pots placed in sunny spots near flowering plants. A well-managed hive could produce 15 to 20 pounds of honey yearly, an incredible luxury for a peasant family. Village records sometimes list beehives as valuable enough to include in wills and marriage contracts alongside land and livestock. Honey did much more than sweeten food. Medieval medical guides recommended it for healing wounds, soothing coughs, and preserving other medicines. As a practical tool, honey's stickiness made it useful for setting hairstyles and even removing unwanted body hair when mixed with other ingredients. These multiple uses made honey all the more precious to those lucky enough to have access to it. When a tiny bit of honey was available, peasants used it with incredible care, adding just a drop to morning porridge, spreading the thinnest layer on bread, or using it to make a special treat for a sick family member. Court records from one medieval English village mention a woman accused of stealing a honey pot. Her punishment was nearly as severe as if she'd stolen a cow, showing how valuable this sweetener was. Wild berries provided seasonal bursts of sweetness that required only the labor of gathering. Strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, and raspberries grew wild in forests and field edges, free for anyone with time to pick them. Unlike honey, berries couldn't be preserved easily without sugar, so they remained strictly seasonal treats. Berry picking became a community activity, with children often sent out in groups to gather these precious fruits. Medieval feast records reveal how special these sweet foods were. When a lord wanted to impress guests, dishes featuring honey and berries often appeared at the end of meals. For peasants invited to these rare feasts, tasting honey-sweetened berry desserts might be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. One old joke told of a peasant who, when asked what he'd do if he were king for a day, replied he would eat berries with honey until my belly ached. A simple dream that shows how rare this combination was for ordinary people. When berries and honey weren't available, medieval peasants sometimes found other starchy foods to fill their hungry bellies. Maybe squirrels were onto something after all. Medieval peasants often turned to the forest floor for food, gathering nuts that modern folks might walk right past. Acorns and chestnuts became crucial backup foods when grain supplies ran low, turning forests into emergency pantries. Chestnuts were the easier of the two to use. Unlike acorns, chestnuts taste sweet naturally and don't require extensive processing. In areas with chestnut forests, especially parts of France, Italy, and Spain, chestnuts became known as the bread tree because they provided starchy nutrition similar to grain. A good chestnut harvest could save a village from winter hunger. How important were chestnuts? Tax records from some medieval villages assessed a household's wealth partly by how many chestnut trees they had access to. In parts of France, chestnuts made up nearly 20% of the peasant diet during winter months. One large chestnut tree could produce up to 200 pounds of nuts in a good year, enough to keep a family alive for weeks if grain ran short. Medieval peasants prepared chestnuts in several ways. Roasting was the simplest. Just toss them in hot ashes until the shells cracked open. Boiling removed more of the tannic acid and made them easier to digest. For long-term storage, chestnuts were often dried and ground into flour that could be mixed with grain flour to stretch bread supplies. This chestnut flour didn't rise as well as wheat flour, but it filled empty stomachs just the same. Acorns required much more work, but could save lives during famine. The bitter tannins in raw acorns make them inedible without processing. Medieval peasants developed methods to remove these bitter compounds, usually by repeatedly soaking crushed acorns in water. The process took days and used lots of water, but the resulting acorn meal could be mixed with grain flour to make barely palatable emergency bread. During the great famines that struck Europe every few decades, these tree nuts became true lifesavers. Court records from the famine of 1315 to 1317 mention people fighting over access to nut-gathering grounds, showing just how valuable these forest foods became when other options disappeared. Even in normal times, clever peasants gathered and stored nuts as insurance against poor harvests. Dried properly, both acorns and chestnuts could last for years. One medieval farming manual recommends storing chestnuts in sand to prevent mold and keep them fresh longer. The forest provided these staples, but it offered much more to those who knew where to look. Some medieval villages had strict rules about who could gather which forest foods and when, showing just how important these wild resources were to everyday survival. When truly desperate times came, peasants turned to an even wider range of hunted foods from fields and forests. Medieval wild food gathering followed the changing seasons, with each month offering different options. Spring brought tender young greens like dandelions, nettles, and sorrel that appeared when food stores were often at their lowest. Young nettles, despite their sting, were among the most valuable spring finds, packed with vitamins and minerals after the long winter diet of grain and preserved foods. Peasants used thick gloves or special picking techniques to harvest them without getting stung, then boiled them to remove the sting. Summer expanded the wild menu dramatically. Meadows and woods filled with edible mushrooms, though picking them required careful knowledge. One medieval village record mentions a family that died after eating poisonous mushrooms during a food shortage, a grim reminder of the risks. Safer options included wild garlic, chickweed, and lamb's quarters, all of which could be added to pottage to stretch meager supplies. Wild onion relatives grew abundantly in many regions. Records show that during the famine years of 1310 to 1322, many communities survived partly on wild leeks and ramps dug from forest floors. These strong flavored plants provided both nutrition and flavor when little else was available. Fall brought nuts, as we've seen, but also rose hips, hawthorn berries, and crab apples, all rich in vitamin C and natural preservatives. These tart fruits rarely made tasty eating on their own, but could be stored for winter medicine and flavoring. Medieval cookbooks sometimes mention these wild fruits as additions to more palatable foods. The gathering skills of peasant women earned special recognition in medieval documents. Manor court records occasionally mention women known as particularly skilled finders of foods, who could locate edible mushrooms, identify useful plants, and knew where the best wild fruit grew. These women sometimes received payment for teaching others or leading gathering groups during hard times. Just how important were these wild foods? Studies of medieval diets suggest that in normal years, gathered plants might make up 5 to 10% of peasant nutrition. During famines, this could jump to 30% or more. One account from the Great Famine tells of villages surviving almost entirely on gathered greens and tree bark for weeks. Medieval law recognized the importance of these foods, too. Many forests and woodlands had specific gleaning rights that allowed peasants to collect wild foods even on lands they didn't own. Legal disputes over these rights appear repeatedly in court records, showing their crucial importance to survival. When even wild plants became scarce, desperate times called for desperate measures. Some medieval peasants turned to making bread from unusual ingredients, using methods that would make even the toughest stomach turn. Ash cakes represented the last line of defense against starvation, a type of primitive bread that could be made with minimal ingredients and zero kitchen tools. The concept was brutally simple. Take whatever ground meal you had, mix it with water to form a thick paste, flatten it into a patty, and cook it directly in the hot ashes of a fire. No oven, no baking stone, not even a pot needed. Just fire, ash, and desperation. During normal times, ash cakes rarely appeared on medieval tables. They were considered emergency food, the kind made only when proper bread wasn't possible. But during the frequent famines that struck medieval Europe, these humble cakes kept countless people alive. What made ash cakes so important was their flexibility. When wheat and rye ran out, any ground grain would work: barley, oats, millet, or even pea flour. When all grain was gone, creative substitutes took their place: ground acorns, dried and ground tree bark, crushed roots, or even ground hay. Records from the famine of 1315 to 1317 describe desperate peasants making ash cakes from dust swept from the floor of the granary, literally the dirt and leftover grain bits from empty storehouses. The cooking method itself dated back to ancient times. Without ovens in their homes, many peasants already cooked flatbreads on heated stones. Ash cakes took this idea one step further, eliminating even the need for the stone. Medieval writings describe how to brush the worst of the ashes off before eating, though gritty teeth were still an occupational hazard of eating this survival food. One surprising advantage of ash cakes was their quick cooking time. Traditional bread required hours of rising, kneading, and baking. Ash cakes could be ready in minutes, a crucial benefit when hunger gnawed and energy for cooking was limited. Medieval work songs sometimes mention ash cakes as field food, made quickly during brief breaks from labor when workers couldn't return home for meals. The taste? About what you'd expect from bread baked in ashes. Smoky, often bitter, and frequently mixed with actual ash, these cakes weren't winning any medieval baking contests. One old joke claimed that ash cakes are the only food that tastes better if you drop them in the mud first, the mud presumably covering the ashy flavor. Despite their unpleasant taste, ash cakes provided the calories needed to survive. During the worst recorded medieval famine, an estimated 15% of Europe's population died of starvation or related illness. Those who survived often did so by eating foods like ash cakes that would normally be considered inedible. A 16th century farming manual includes a grim but practical piece of advice. When grain fails and bread cannot be made in the usual way, the wise peasant remembers the ways of cooking in ash, for it has saved our people since time beyond memory. In the harshest times, even ash cakes might not be possible if ingredients ran too low. That's when medieval peasants turned to true improvisation. The best medieval dish wasn't actually a dish at all. It was simply whatever bits and pieces happened to be around, thrown together in a pot and called dinner. Medieval peasants were masters of kitchen improv, centuries before it became trendy to clean out your fridge and make a meal from the random leftovers. This whatever we have approach wasn't just common, it was daily life for most families. Old records from manor kitchens show carefully planned meals with specific ingredients, but peasant cooking rarely followed recipes. Instead, it followed a simple rule: use what's available, waste nothing, and make it filling enough to work another day. What might a typical whatever we have meal look like? In spring, it could be a handful of wild greens tossed with the last winter turnips and a few dried peas. Summer might bring a mix of garden vegetables with a tiny bit of bacon fat for flavor. Fall could mean mushrooms and nuts added to cabbage. Winter often meant scraping by with whatever preserved foods remained in storage. The cooking method was equally flexible. Got a fire going all day? Throw everything in a pot and make soup. Need to work in the fields until dark? Leave ingredients simmering all day in a covered pot buried in hot ashes. No time to cook at all? Cold leftovers mixed with a chunk of bread would do. This flexible eating style developed out of necessity. Unlike modern times, where most people eat 3 separate meals daily, medieval peasants often ate just once or twice. Records from farming communities show that during busy seasons like harvest, workers might eat a small morning meal, Then, a single large meal after the day's work ended. This pattern made the whatever we have approach even more practical. One cooking session using whatever was available. The mixing of odd ingredients sometimes created surprisingly good results. Several dishes that later became regional specialties started as peasant whatever we have meals. The Italian ribollita began as reheated leftover bread and vegetables. French ratatouille originated as a summer clean-out-the-garden dish. Many stews, casseroles, and one-pot meals across Europe began as peasant improvisation rather than planned recipes. Medieval tax records give us hints about these mixed meals. When paying taxes in food, peasants often delivered oddly specific combinations: 3 turnips, half a cabbage, and a handful of dried peas, for example. These random groupings likely represented whatever was actually available that day, not planned combinations. During holidays and celebrations, even the whatever we have meals got an upgrade. Saved bits of special ingredients might appear: a precious pinch of salt, a rare spice traded from a passing merchant, or the first fresh vegetables of spring. These small luxuries transformed ordinary mixed meals into feasts by peasant standards. A medieval French saying claimed that the best sauce is hunger, meaning that any food tastes good when you're truly hungry. Peasants living through the hardships of medieval life understood this better than anyone. Their creative approach to cooking with limited resources wasn't just about survival, it was the original farm-to-table cuisine, shaped by seasons, necessity, and remarkable human adaptability. Let's start with the warhammer. This weapon embodied this brutal efficiency perfectly. Knights spent small fortunes on their plate armor, believing themselves nearly invincible on the battlefield. A well-crafted suit of armor could indeed turn away sword strikes and deflect arrows, leading many wealthy warriors to think they'd solved the problem of battlefield mortality. Then someone invented the warhammer, and suddenly that expensive metal shell became less protection and more of a personal coffin. Unlike swords that would harmlessly glance off plate armor, warhammers focused tremendous force into a small area. One solid hit could cave in a helmet and the skull underneath, without needing to penetrate the metal at all. The physics was brutal but effective. The energy had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was straight into the knight's brain. Knights probably thought they were getting the medieval equivalent of a tank, but ended up with something closer to a dinner bell. Ding! One crushed skull ready to serve. Many warhammers featured a wicked spike on the reverse side, turning the weapon into a versatile tool of destruction. Hammer side for crushing, spike side for puncturing. When your enemy wears a metal can, you simply need the right can opener. This design versatility made the warhammer a practical solution to the problem of heavily armored opponents. A knight might survive a sword blow thanks to his armor, but the concentrated force of a hammer strike transmitted through the metal would liquefy the tissue beneath. The horrifying sounds of a warhammer is connecting with a helmet, a distinctive crunch that signaled the end of a knight's career and often his life. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English men-at-arms used warhammers to devastating effect against French knights who had become stuck in the muddy battlefield. Unable to maneuver effectively, these knights found their expensive armor transforming from protection into a death trap. What made warhammers particularly democratic weapons of their day was their accessibility. You didn't need years of training like with a sword. You just needed enough strength to swing it and enough anger to aim it at someone you didn't like. This made them popular among common soldiers who couldn't afford extensive combat training. It was perhaps history's first example of user-friendly design, though the user manual would have been disturbingly brief. Pointy end toward enemy, swing hard. Archaeological findings have uncovered warhammers with heads weighing up to 7 pounds, a significant mass when swung at the end of a 3-foot handle. The resulting momentum could easily crush bone, even through plate armor that would have stopped a sword or an arrow. Some specimens found in Eastern European collections show signs of repeated impact, with hammer faces worn smooth from use, silent testimony to the weapon's effectiveness. Interestingly, as armor improved throughout the medieval period, so did the warhammer. Earlier versions were little more than modified tools, but later designs became increasingly specialized for combat. By the 15th century, some warhammers featured armor-piercing spikes, reinforced shafts, and specially designed striking surfaces meant to punch through even the finest Milan steel. It was an arms race in miniature, As armor got better, hammers got deadlier. Knights spent years training in the chivalric arts, mastering swordsmanship and lance techniques, only to be taken down by a commoner with what amounted to an upgraded tool. There was something profoundly democratic about it. No matter your social status or wealth, your skull was equally crushable when facing a determined opponent with a warhammer. While the warhammer excelled at dealing with armored opponents through brute force, medieval weaponsmiths were just getting started with their deadly innovations. One of them is the spiked metal ball attached to a wooden handle by a length of chain. The flail represented medieval weapon design at its most unpredictable. This weapon couldn't have been more different from the straightforward warhammer. It was temperamental, difficult to master, and refused to follow the laws of physics in the way more conventional weapons did. If the warhammer was the reliable workhorse of medieval combat, the flail was its moody artistic cousin with anger management issues. The basic design was deceptively simple. Take a wooden handle, attach a chain, and secure a metal ball covered in spikes to the other end. But this simplicity masked a weapon of terrifying complexity in actual use. The chain created a delay between the wielder's movement and the impact of the striking head, making timing extraordinarily difficult to master. Many medieval manuscripts describe the lengthy training required to use a flail effectively, with novices spending months learning to avoid striking themselves before ever facing an opponent. Medieval weapon instructors must have had the easiest job interviews. Self-injury was remarkably common among flail users. Historical records from military hospitals across medieval Europe document numerous injuries sustained during flail training. Modern experimental archaeologists attempting to master flail techniques have confirmed it, with many suffering bruises, lacerations, and even broken bones during practice sessions. The flail has the unique distinction of being the only medieval weapon with a confirmed kill count against its own users. A flail user needed to develop not just strength, but a keen spatial awareness and precise control over the weapon's momentum, or at least enough awareness to draft a will before practice sessions. Given these challenges, why would anyone choose such a difficult weapon? The answer lies in its unique advantages against the heavily armored opponents of the late medieval period. The flexible chain allowed the striking head to bypass shields and other defensive implements that would have stopped a rigid weapon like a sword or mace. A shield raised to block a flail could still result in the spiked ball wrapping around its edge to strike the defender. This unpredictability made the flail particularly effective against defensive fighters who relied on precise blocking techniques. Your shield technique is impeccable, Sir Knight. Anyway, here's a spiky surprise coming in from a completely different angle. The physics of the flail also gave it tremendous striking power. The chain acted as a force multiplier, creating a whip-like effect that concentrated energy into the striking head. Tests conducted on modern reproductions have shown that a flail can deliver up to 40% more force than a rigid weapon of similar weight. When this force was combined with the armor-piercing potential of the spikes, the result was a weapon capable of causing catastrophic injuries even to armored opponents. Medieval knights learned the hard way that momentum wasn't just a fancy physics term, it was what turned their expensive armor into an elaborate colander. Multiple variations of the flail existed throughout medieval Europe. The most common was the single-headed military flail with a spiked iron ball, but more exotic versions have been documented in historical texts and artwork. Some flails featured multiple chains and striking heads, transforming the already chaotic weapon into something even more unpredictable. Because nothing says, "I have a death wish," quite like doubling down on an already uncontrollable weapon. A particularly notorious variant from Eastern Europe incorporated small hollow chambers in the striking heads that produced a terrifying whistling sound when swung. This psychological weapon added an element of terror to an already fearsome device, disorienting opponents before impact. It was the medieval version of psychological warfare. Is that whistling sound getting closer? Or, oh, there's a hole in my helmet now. The flail gained a reputation as a weapon that required special countermeasures. Knights trained specifically to deal with flail wielders, learning to predict the arc of the striking head and time their movements to avoid its deadly impact. These specialized techniques highlight how seriously the threat of the flail was taken on medieval battlefields. While less common than swords or spears, flails occupied a special place in a knight's nightmare. a weapon whose movement could not be easily predicted or countered. Knights probably had PTSD flashbacks every time they heard a chain rattle or watched someone swing a bag of groceries. The flail's reputation extended beyond the battlefield. In several European regions, it became associated with peasant uprisings due to its agricultural origins. The military flail evolved from the grain flail, a farming tool used to separate grain from husks. During times of rebellion, peasants often modified these familiar tools into weapons, creating folk variants of the military flail. These makeshift weapons proved surprisingly effective against armored opponents, contributing to the success of several peasant revolts throughout the medieval period. Talk about workplace repurposing. One day you're threshing wheat, the next day you're threshing nobles. The Hussite rebels of 15th century Bohemia became particularly infamous for their effective use of flails against fully armored opponents. The unpredictable movement of the striking head made defensive maneuvers difficult to time correctly. Even experienced knights might find themselves hesitating in the face of a weapon that defied standard defensive tactics. This moment of hesitation could prove fatal on the battlefield, where split-second decisions often determine survival. The flail created existential crises on the battlefield. Is the spiked ball coming at my face, or wait, where did it go? Oh, there it is, somehow behind me. While the warhammer brought direct crushing force to deal with armored opponents, the flail introduced an element of chaos that even the most heavily armored knight had reason to fear. But for all its unpredictability, the flail still required a trained warrior to wield it effectively. Other weapons would emerge that placed deadly force. The Godendag, a Flemish term meaning good day, represents one of history's most effective examples of straightforward weapon design. This unassuming weapon changed the course of medieval warfare by placing deadly power in the hands of common soldiers. At first glance, a Godendag appears almost primitive, a stout wooden club with a single metal spike protruding from the end. Nothing about its appearance suggests the revolutionary impact it would have on European battlefields. Yet this simple design concealed a tactical versatility that made it devastating against even the most heavily armored opponents. The effectiveness of the Godendag stemmed from its dual-purpose design. The spike could puncture armor or unseat mounted knights, while the heavy club portion delivered crushing blows to opponents who had been knocked to the ground. This combination made it the perfect weapon for foot soldiers facing armored cavalry, a common scenario in medieval warfare. The weapon's defining moment came at the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, commonly known as the Battle of the Golden Spurs. On July 11th of that year, an army of Flemish townspeople and peasants faced a force of French knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. The French were so confident of victory that they brought along a special wagon filled with ropes to bind their expected prisoners. What happened next shocked the medieval world. The Flemish militia, armed primarily with Godendags, utterly destroyed the French knights. The battlefield was so littered with golden spurs, a symbol of knighthood, that the conflict gained its alternative name. How did an army of commoners defeat Europe's premier fighting force? The genius of the Godendag lay in its application against mounted knights. Flemish fighters developed a specific technique: brace the base of the weapon against the ground, pointing the spike upward toward an oncoming horse. The charging knight, carried forward by his own momentum, would impale either himself or his mount on the spike. Once dismounted, the knight became vulnerable to the club end of the weapon, which could crush skulls even through helmets. This battle revealed a harsh truth about medieval warfare. Even the most sophisticated armor and years of training could be undone by a determined opponent with the right tool. The Godendag cost perhaps 1/50th the price of a knight's equipment, yet proved more decisive on that bloody field. Military historians mark Courtrai as the beginning of the end for the dominance of heavy cavalry in European warfare. Surviving examples of Godendags show remarkable variation in size and design. Some featured shorter handles for tight formation fighting, while others extended to nearly 6 feet in length for front-rank troops. The spike might be short and pyramidal or long and slender, depending on its intended use against different types of armor. This variation suggests that, despite its simple appearance, the Godendag underwent continuous refinement based on battlefield experience. For centuries, knights had cultivated an image of martial superiority, with elaborate codes of combat and expensive equipment serving as barriers to entry for common soldiers. The Godendog shattered this mystique by proving that a simple weapon in trained hands could overcome aristocratic advantages. After Courtrai, chronicles record a notable change in how nobles spoke about infantry, with newfound respect tinged with fear. Manufacturing a Godendog required minimal resources and expertise compared to more complex weapons. A village blacksmith could produce the metal spike, while any competent woodworker could fashion the club portion. This accessibility made it possible for entire communities to arm themselves quickly during times of conflict. During the Flemish revolt against French rule, historical records indicate that towns could outfit hundreds of militia members with these weapons in a matter of weeks. The Godendog also influenced military training methods. Unlike swords or flails that required years to master, effective use of the Godendog could be taught to recruits in days. Military documents from the period describe drilling formations of Godendog wielders to create an interlocking wall of spikes against cavalry charges. This standardized training transformed groups of individual fighters into coordinated units capable of standing against mounted knights. The weapon's legacy extends beyond the medieval period. The concept of combining piercing and crushing elements in a single infantry weapon influenced polearm design for centuries. Later weapons like the halberd and pollux incorporated similar principles, but with more elaborate construction. Even as these more sophisticated designs emerged, the Godendog remained in use among militia forces well into the 16th century, a testament to its enduring effectiveness. The rise of firearms would eventually render most medieval melee weapons obsolete, including the Godendog. Yet this simple weapon had already changed warfare by proving that technological advantage didn't always require complexity or expense. Sometimes the most revolutionary tools are also the most straightforward, a lesson that military innovators continue to rediscover. While the Godendog empowered common soldiers with its simplicity, other medieval weapons took the opposite approach. The Zweihänder embodied extravagant excess. This enormous two-handed sword dominated battlefields through its sheer imposing presence and the devastating power it delivered in the hands of skilled warriors. If the warhammer was medieval problem-solving through brute force and the flail was medieval chaos theory in action, the Zweihänder was medieval overcompensation in weapon form. Zweihänder translates from German as two-hander, a straightforward name for a weapon that was anything but simple. These massive swords measured between 5 and 6 feet long, with some exceptional specimens reaching nearly 7 feet. The blade alone could extend over 4 feet, with a grip long enough to accommodate both hands with room to spare. These weren't just big swords, they were portable siege weapons disguised as blades. When your sword is taller than most of the people you're fighting, you're not just making a statement about your combat style, but possibly compensating for something else entirely. The weight of a typical Zweihänder ranged from 7 to 14 pounds, with most battlefield versions falling closer to the lighter end of that spectrum. This might not sound particularly heavy until you consider the exhaustion of swinging such a weapon repeatedly during combat. Modern martial arts tests with authentic Zweihänders have shown that even trained athletes struggle to maintain effective fighting form for more than a few minutes. The physical demands placed on historical users must have been extraordinary. These warriors didn't need two hands just because the manual said so. They needed them because otherwise their arms would have fallen off after the third swing. German mercenaries known as Landsknechts specialized in wielding these enormous weapons. These professional soldiers emerged in the late 15th century and quickly gained a reputation as some of Europe's most effective fighters. Within Landsknecht formations, Zweihänder wielders received double pay due to the skill and strength required to use the weapon effectively, earning them the title Doppelsöldner, or double pay men. This financial incentive drew the biggest and strongest recruits to train with the massive swords. Medieval job descriptions didn't get more straightforward. Must have 2 functioning hands, forearms like tree trunks, and a complete disregard for reasonable weapon proportions. Double salary, triple food rations. Primary sources describe the specialized role these sword wielders played on the battlefield. Rather than fighting in conventional formations, Zweihänder users often operated as formation breakers, charging directly into opposing pike squares to disrupt their cohesion. The long reach of the Zweihänder allowed its user to cut through multiple pike shafts with a single powerful swing, creating gaps that could be exploited by following troops. Pike formations, previously considered nearly impenetrable, suddenly had a counter-weapon to fear. Imagine the horror of watching someone charge your impenetrable formation with what amounted to a 6-foot razor blade. It was like bringing a metal tree to a stick fight. The design of the Zweihänder evolved significantly throughout its service life. Early versions resembled oversized longswords, but later models incorporated specialized features for battlefield effectiveness. Most notable was the addition of a ricasso, an unsharpened section of blade just above the crossguard, often wrapped in leather to provide an additional gripping surface. This feature allowed for more controlled handling, with the wielder placing one hand on the grip and the other on the ricasso for leverage in close combat. When your sword is so big it needs its own handle halfway up the blade, you might have taken the two hands concept a bit too literally. Many Zweihänders also featured parrying hooks or flukes projecting from the blade near the crossguard. These secondary guards served multiple purposes. They protected the user's hands, provided additional leverage for controlling an opponent's weapon, and could be used to trap and disarm enemies during combat. These hooks transformed the sword from a pure cutting tool into a multi-purpose battlefield implement that could slash, thrust, hook, and trap enemy weapons. It was the medieval Swiss Army knife if that knife were 6 feet long and required Olympic-level strength to lift. One military observer noted how enemy formations would visibly recoil at the approach of Landsknechts carrying these enormous swords. The distinctive profile of the Zweihänder, especially when carried upright with the blade resting on the shoulder, created an impression of superhuman warriors that could demoralize opponents before battle even began. Half the battle was psychological. When you see someone casually resting what looks like an entire blacksmith shop on their shoulder, running in the opposite direction suddenly seems like a career-enhancing move. Training with the Zweihänder required specialized techniques unlike those used with smaller swords. Surviving fighting manuals illustrate specific stances and movements designed to manage the weapon's momentum rather than fight against it. Users learned to flow from one strike to another, maintaining constant motion to avoid becoming vulnerable during recovery. A properly trained Zweihänder wielder moved with a dancer's precision, transforming the unwieldy blade into an extension of their body. Medieval Zweihänder training manuals likely began with an important disclaimer. Results may vary based on how many times you've skipped arm day. At the Battle of Bicaka in 1522, Landsknechts armed with Zweihänders carved paths through dense Swiss pike formations that had previously been considered unbreakable. The psychological shock of seeing their invincible pike walls devastated by these enormous swords contributed to a significant Swiss defeat and marked a turning point in infantry tactics. The Swiss pikemen learned an important lesson that day. When the enemy brings a sword so big it needs its own zip code, your unbreakable formation is about to experience some unscheduled renovations. Despite their effectiveness, Zweihänders remained specialist weapons rather than standard issue equipment. The extensive training requirements, physical demands, and material costs limited their distribution to elite troops. A quality Zweihänder required significant quantities of high-grade steel and the skills of master swordsmiths, making them expensive investments even for well-funded mercenary companies. When your weapon costs as much as a small house and requires the muscle development of a professional athlete, mass production isn't really an option. These massive swords remained in active military use longer than might be expected, with documented battlefield deployments continuing into the early 17th century, well into the age of firearms. This longevity speaks to their continued effectiveness even as military technology evolved around them. The Zweihänder found particular use in defending narrow passages like breaches in city walls, where their long reach and devastating cutting power could hold back multiple attackers. Nothing said, "This doorway is closed," quite like a man with a sword the size of a small tree standing in the breach. Surviving examples display remarkable craftsmanship alongside their intimidating dimensions. Museum specimens often feature elaborate etching, gilded inscriptions, and complex hilts that showcase the prestige associated with these weapons. The classic Zweihänder silhouette became a status symbol among mercenary companies, with ornately decorated examples serving as parade weapons and symbols of unit pride. Some were so elaborately decorated that they probably spent more time being admired than used in battle, the medieval equivalent of that sports car that never leaves the garage. While the Zweihander represented the height of offensive capability through sheer size and reach, medieval weapon designers also created specialized tools for more selective battlefield tasks. Medieval battlefields were not always about killing. Sometimes capturing an opponent alive offered far greater rewards than simply adding another body to the pile. Enter the man-catcher, a weapon specifically designed not to end lives, but to ensure prisoners remained both alive and compliant. Because sometimes killing your enemies wasn't enough, you needed to invoice them afterward. Unlike the massive Zweihander that announced its deadly purpose with every swing, the man-catcher operated on a principle of cruel efficiency. The basic design consisted of a long pole topped with a hinged metal collar lined with inward-facing spikes or barbs. When placed around an opponent's neck or limb and closed, these spikes prevented escape without causing immediate fatal injuries. Medieval engineers had essentially created a portable, instant prison cell on a stick, proof that catch and release was never part of the medieval combat philosophy. The economics of medieval warfare made the man-catcher an extremely practical tool. Knights and nobles represented significant financial investments, both in their equipment and in their potential ransom value. A dead knight yielded only his armor and weapons as spoils. A captured knight, however, could bring a fortune in ransom money. Historical records show ransoms reaching astronomical sums, with some high-ranking nobles commanding payments equivalent to several years' worth of a town's tax revenue. One particularly valuable French noble captured during the 100 Years' War was ransomed for the modern equivalent of $6 million. Medieval accountants had figured out something important. Dead knights were a one-time transaction, but live ones were recurring revenue streams. Operating a man-catcher required less strength than weapons like the Warhammer or Zweihander, but demanded precise timing and positioning. Users were trained to target mounted opponents, using the long reach of the pole to snare a knight's neck or limb and then twist to unseat them from their horse. Once on the ground, an armored knight became surprisingly vulnerable, weighted down by the very equipment meant to protect them. The irony wasn't lost on medieval soldiers. Nothing says, "Your protection has become your prison," quite like watching a nobleman waddle helplessly in his own custom-fitted metal cage. The weapon proved particularly effective against helmet designs that protected the face but restricted peripheral vision, allowing man-catcher wielders to approach from angles their targets couldn't easily monitor. For all the elaborate engineering of medieval headgear, someone forgot the simple check your blind spots feature that might have prevented many a knight from becoming an unwilling participant in medieval catch and carry. Regional variations reflected different tactical needs. Germanic versions typically featured longer poles for safely reaching mounted opponents, while Mediterranean variants incorporated elaborate catching mechanisms, including spring-loaded components. Some advanced designs included secondary mechanisms that could tighten the collar further after initial capture, ensuring that struggling only increased the prisoner's discomfort. Medieval weaponsmiths had effectively invented the quit struggling or it gets worse principle long before modern restraint technology. Using man-catchers required specialized team tactics rather than individual prowess. Military manuscripts describe formations of 3 to 5 soldiers working together to capture high-value targets. One soldier would manage the man-catcher itself, while others provided protection and helped secure the prisoner once captured. These capture teams became highly valued units within medieval armies, receiving bonus payments for successfully taking important enemies alive. They were the medieval equivalent of repo men, except instead of taking your cart for missed payments, they took you for missed battlefield victories. The weapon found particular favor among forces tasked with urban security and riot control. City watch units from Venice to London maintained man-catchers as standard equipment for apprehending criminals in crowded streets. Their ability to control an opponent without necessarily causing fatal injuries made them ideal for situations where indiscriminate killing might spark broader unrest. Medieval catch-and-release programs had a very different meaning than today's fishing regulations. Nobles attempting to avoid capture developed specific countermeasures against man-catchers. Some knight orders modified their armor to include reinforced collars that prevented the weapon from gaining purchase around the neck. Others trained specifically to recognize and counter man-catcher wielders on the battlefield, targeting them as priority threats. Nothing motivated innovation quite like the prospect of being paraded home in a neck collar while your family sold the summer castle to pay your ransom. Unlike many medieval weapons that became obsolete with the advent of firearms, man-catchers maintained practical utility even as battlefield technology evolved. Their ability to control opponents at a distance without killing them fulfilled a need that guns could not. Modified versions appeared in law enforcement contexts well into the 19th century, particularly in regions where controlling suspects without firearms remained a priority. When your weapon doubled as an ATM withdrawal tool for enemy noblemen, you made sure to keep it in good working order. As we shift from the careful restraint of the man-catcher to our next weapon, we enter the realm of medieval combat where mercy was never part of the design specifications. The Morning Star represented medieval brutality distilled into its purest form, a heavy metal ball covered in spikes designed to deliver catastrophic damage with every strike. If nightmares could be forged in iron, they'd look exactly like this. The name Morning Star comes from the weapon's visual resemblance to the planet Venus. The bright morning star, when fitted with its characteristic metal spikes radiating outward from the central core. The poetic name stands in stark contrast to its decidedly unpoetic function on the battlefield. Medieval warriors had a peculiar talent for giving beautiful names to absolutely horrifying weapons. This particular star didn't grant wishes so much as ensure your enemies wouldn't be making any more of their own. Unlike its cousin the flail, the Morning Star had no chain connecting the striking head to the handle. This direct attachment made it far more reliable and easier to control in the chaos of combat, turning your average nightmare into a precision-guided bad dream. A typical Morning Star consisted of three main components: a wooden shaft for gripping, a metal mounting system, and the spiked striking head. This head could range from a relatively modest 3-inch diameter with half-inch spikes to massive versions spanning 6 inches across with spikes extending 2 to 3 inches from the surface. The largest specimens recovered from European battlefields weigh upwards of 10 pounds, heavy enough to shatter bones even without the added trauma of the spikes. When your weapon is essentially a medieval porcupine on a stick, subtlety was never going to be part of the design philosophy. The physics behind the Morning Star made it devastatingly effective against armored opponents. The weapon concentrated tremendous force into the small contact points represented by each spike tip. When swung against plate armor, these spikes could punch through metal that would have turned aside sword cuts or even direct hammer blows. The resulting wounds were notoriously difficult to treat with medieval medical techniques, leading to high mortality rates even among knights who survived the initial combat. This spike nightmare didn't just hurt you, it ensured medieval surgeons would have nightmares of their own trying to patch you up afterward. Archaeological evidence reveals the Morning Star's grim effectiveness. Skeletal remains from medieval battle sites show distinctive patterns of trauma associated with these weapons, clustered puncture wounds with massive underlying bone fractures. Medieval battlefield injuries could often be identified by weapon type, with Morning Star victims being perhaps the only soldiers in history who died from an acute case of too many holes. The Morning Star didn't just kill, it left a calling card that archaeologists could identify centuries later. The Morning Star required less technical skill than weapons like the sword or flail, but demanded considerable upper body strength to wield effectively. Military training manuals from the period recommend specific exercises to build the necessary shoulder and arm power, including practice swings with progressively heavier training versions. Once mastered, however, the Morning Star offered devastating returns on this investment of training time, particularly against well-armored opponents. The Morning Star was the medieval equivalent of that gym membership you actually use, except the results weren't just impressive biceps, but impressive body counts. Tactical applications varied across different military contexts. Mounted knights favored shorter-handled versions that could be wielded from horseback, delivering devastating overhead strikes augmented by the rider's elevated position and the horse's momentum. Infantry formations typically employed longer-shafted variants that could be swung in wide arcs to clear space around the wielder or thrust forward like impromptu spears when necessary. This versatility made the Morning Star a surprisingly adaptable nightmare, capable of ruining someone's day from multiple positions and distances. The psychological impact of facing Morning Star armed troops should not be underestimated. The weapon was particularly fear-inducing, with its distinctive profile triggering primal fears even in seasoned warriors. This psychological effect became a tactical advantage, with some military leaders deliberately positioning Morningstar wielders at the front of formations to demoralize opponents before contact was even made. Nothing says, perhaps we should reconsider this battle, quite like facing a line of soldiers carrying what appear to be medieval torture devices with handles. Variations of the Morningstar appeared across Europe and Asia, with regional designs reflecting local military traditions and manufacturing capabilities. Eastern European versions featured more numerous but shorter spikes optimized for penetrating the lighter armor common in those regions. Western European designs incorporated fewer but longer spikes, specifically engineered to defeat high-quality plate armor. The Spike Nightmare proved adaptable enough to evolve alongside armor technology, ensuring no protective gear could provide sweet dreams when facing this weapon. Religious imagery sometimes incorporated the Morningstar in unexpected ways. Medieval artwork occasionally depicts angels wielding these weapons against demons, suggesting that even divine retribution might require spiked implements. This religious association gave rise to the weapon's alternative name in some regions, the Holy Water Sprinkler, a grimly humorous reference to the blood spray produced when the weapon found its mark. Medieval humor tended toward the macabre, and nothing says, "Go with God," quite like a face full of metal spikes. These weapons offered a form of last rites that came with complementary dental work, though few patients survived to appreciate their new smile. The legacy of the Morningstar extends beyond its battlefield use. The distinctive silhouette became a visual shorthand for brutality in medieval artwork, appearing in depictions of hell and divine punishment. This visual association was so strong that Morningstars were sometimes mounted above city gates or government buildings as warnings against lawbreaking, serving as three-dimensional symbols of authority's power to inflict punishment. While other medieval weapons might eventually be forgotten, this spiked nightmare continues to haunt our collective imagination as the definitive symbol of medieval brutality. While the Morningstar represented direct and unsubtle violence, medieval weapon designers also created more specialized tools. The bec de Corbin represented a thoughtful approach to the problem of killing armored opponents. Its name, French for raven's beak, perfectly described its most distinctive feature, a wickedly curved spike resembling a bird's beak, designed specifically to punch through plate armor with terrifying efficiency. The bec de Corbin belongs to the polearm family of weapons, those mounted on long wooden shafts to provide reach and leverage. What set this particular polearm apart was its versatile head design, which incorporated multiple weapon types into a single lethal package. On one side sat the namesake spike or beak, curved downward and tapered to a sharp point. The opposite side typically featured a hammerhead for delivering crushing blows. Many versions also included a straight spike extending from the top, allowing for thrusting attacks similar to a spear. This 3-in-1 design made the bec de Corbin the medieval equivalent of a Swiss army knife, though its functions were limited to various methods of inflicting grievous harm. Knights who carried one never had to worry about bringing the wrong tool to a fight. It was the battlefield multitasker that asked the important question, how would you prefer your armor penetrated today? Pierced, crushed, or skewered? A skilled wielder could alternate between piercing, crushing, and thrusting attacks without changing weapons, responding to different armor types and combat situations with remarkable flexibility. Medieval combat manuals describe specific techniques for each attack form, suggesting that warriors trained extensively to make full use of the weapon's versatility. The physics behind the bec de Corbin's effectiveness stemmed from simple mechanical advantage. The long wooden shaft, typically 5 to 7 feet in length, created a lever that multiplied the wielder's striking force. When that amplified force was concentrated into the small contact point of the beak or top spike, the pressure could exceed 4,000 pounds per square inch, more than enough to penetrate even the finest plate armor. For context, modern ballistic tests have shown that most medieval plate armor could withstand pressures of around 2,000 pounds per square inch before failing. The distinctive sound was made when a bec de Corbin punched through plate armor, a high-pitched screech followed by a dull thud as the spike penetrated the underlying body. Some military chroniclers noted that experienced soldiers could distinguish this sound on the battlefield and recognized it as a particularly bad omen for the recipient. When you heard that noise, someone had just received a special delivery courtesy of the Raven's Beak Postal Service. No signature required, delivery confirmed. Training with the bec de corbin demanded more technical skill than many other medieval weapons. The weapon's weight distribution made it unwieldy for beginners, requiring months of practice to master. Military treatises from the period recommend specific progressive training regimens, beginning with basic strikes against stationary targets and advancing to complex combination attacks against moving opponents. Knights who mastered these techniques became particularly feared on the battlefield, able to defeat heavily armored opponents who might have been nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. The bec de corbin found particular favor among foot soldiers tasked with fighting mounted knights. The weapon's length allowed infantry to strike riders from a relatively safe distance, while the specialized head design could either unseat the knight or deliver fatal blows through armor. Military records from several major late medieval battles credit infantry armed with these weapons for defeating previously dominant heavy cavalry forces. The Battle of Courtrai in 1302 saw Flemish infantry armed with similar polearms defeat the elite French heavy cavalry, fundamentally changing medieval warfare by proving that well-equipped foot soldiers could overcome mounted knights. Manufacturing a quality bec de corbin required collaboration between specialized craftsmen. Blacksmiths forged the complex head, carefully hardening the striking surfaces while maintaining enough flexibility in the socket to prevent breaking under impact. Woodworkers selected ash or oak shafts, paying careful attention to the grain pattern to ensure the pole could withstand the tremendous forces involved in combat. The joining of head to shaft represented a particularly critical manufacturing step, with high-quality examples featuring reinforced sockets and additional strapping to prevent separation during use. The distinctive silhouette, particularly the curved beak, created an ominous impression even before combat began. The intimidating sight of infantry formations bristling with these weapons, their curved beaks catching the light like rows of predatory birds waiting to strike. For knights who had spent fortunes on armor they believed would protect them, the sight of weapons specifically designed to defeat that protection proved particularly demoralizing. It was like watching someone approach your brand new state-of-the-art security door with the exact specialized key you were told didn't exist. All that money spent on armor, and these infantry soldiers were walking around with what amounted to Nightkin Opener's Special Edition. Regional variations of the bec de corbin reflected different military traditions and tactical needs. Italian versions typically featured longer, more slender beaks optimized for penetrating the high-quality plate armor produced in Milan and other Italian manufacturing centers. French designs often incorporated broader hammer faces, creating a better balance between piercing and crushing capabilities. Eastern European variants sometimes included additional hooks or tines, allowing the weapon to be used for disarming opponents or pulling riders from horseback. The weapon remained in active military use for an impressively long period, with documented battlefield deployments spanning from the late 13th century through the early 16th century. This longevity speaks to its fundamental effectiveness against armored opponents, even as armor design continuously evolved in response to such weapons. The ongoing arms race between armor and anti-armor weapons drove innovation on both sides, with each new defensive improvement spurring corresponding offensive adjustments. The legacy of the bec de corbin extends beyond its battlefield use. The distinctive head design influenced later polearm development, with elements appearing in weapons used well into the age of firearms. Modern tactical entry tools used by law enforcement and military forces incorporate similar design principles, particularly in breaching tools that combine piercing, prying, and striking functions in single implements. The fundamental concept, a versatile weapon head mounted on a leverage-enhancing shaft, proved so effective that its core principles remain relevant in specialized equipment today. While the bec de corbin represented the height of hand-to-hand anti-armor technology, medieval military engineers were simultaneously developing weapons that could deliver death from much greater distances. The ballista marked humanity's first serious attempt to solve warfare's oldest problem: how to kill people who are inconveniently far away. While the bec de corbin allowed warriors to strike armored opponents at arm's length, the ballista extended that reach to hundreds of yards. This massive weapon essentially scaled up the humble crossbow to terrifying proportions, creating a siege engine capable of punching through multiple armored soldiers with a single shot. At its core, the ballista operated on a simple principle: store energy in twisted skeins of animal sinew or rope, then release it explosively to propel a large projectile. The resulting weapon could launch bolts weighing up to 26 pounds at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. These projectiles carried enough momentum to penetrate shields, armor, and multiple bodies in a single shot. Unlike arrows that rained down in predictable arcs, ballista bolts traveled in relatively flat trajectories at speeds too fast for the human eye to track effectively. Soldiers described the terrifying experience of watching comrades suddenly impaled by massive bolts that seemed to materialize without warning. This invisible death from afar created a unique form of battlefield anxiety. You might survive a sword fight through skill, but avoiding a ballista bolt came down to nothing but luck. Medieval troops called this God's dice, though the deity they referenced likely wasn't the one they prayed to on Sundays. Operating a ballista required specialized training and typically a crew of at least 3 to 5 soldiers. One soldier aimed the weapon, while others managed the winding mechanism that tensioned the skein. A well-trained crew could achieve firing rates of 2 to 3 shots per minute. Not rapid fire by modern standards, but fast enough to create havoc in tightly packed formations. These crews developed their own specialized vocabulary and techniques, becoming highly valued specialists within medieval armies. Their status reflected a harsh battlefield truth: a single well-placed ballista could inflict more casualties than dozens of conventional fighters. Size variations existed throughout the medieval period, ranging from cart-mounted versions that required just 2 crew members to massive fixed emplacements demanding teams of 8 or more. The largest documented examples could launch projectiles weighing over 100 pounds, though these behemoths typically fired stones rather than bolts and functioned more like artillery than oversized crossbows. These larger variants stayed in active military use well into the age of early firearms, proving effective long after many other medieval weapons had been relegated to museum displays. The ballista represented an early form of force multiplication, allowing a small number of soldiers to project lethal power far beyond their individual capabilities. While impressive in its range and penetrating power, the ballista still focused primarily on targeting individual soldiers or small groups. Medieval military engineers, however, were just getting started with their long-distance killing innovations. The Scorpion earned its name honestly: quick, deadly, and with a sting you never saw coming. While the ballista excelled at penetrating multiple targets with massive bolts, the Scorpion prioritized speed and accuracy over raw power. This lighter, more mobile torsion weapon could be repositioned quickly on the battlefield, allowing medieval armies to respond to developing threats with precisely targeted death from distances that seemed almost magical to medieval soldiers. Originally developed by Roman engineers, the Scorpion disappeared during the early medieval period, only to be rediscovered and improved upon during the Crusades. The weapon's key innovation lay in its dual torsion bundles, twisted skeins of animal sinew or human hair that stored tremendous energy. When released, these bundles propelled a dart-like projectile with enough force to penetrate shields and armor at ranges exceeding 400 yards. Medieval armies basically rediscovered that you can solve most military problems by finding new ways to hurl pointy objects at your enemies really, really fast. The Scorpion was just particularly good at making sure those pointy objects reached exactly the right person at the wrong time in their day. What made the Scorpion particularly feared was its accuracy. Skilled operators could target specific individuals on the battlefield, making it the medieval equivalent of a sniper rifle. Medieval soldiers quickly learned to fear these weapons, as death could come without warning from an enemy too distant to even identify clearly. One moment you'd be shouting orders to your troops, the next moment explaining yourself at the pearly gates with a large hole where your previous career plans used to be. A well-trained Scorpion team achieved remarkable firing rates, up to 10 bolts per minute, in the hands of elite operators. This combination of rate of fire, accuracy, and penetrating power made the Scorpion disproportionately influential on the battlefield. Military historians estimate that during the Siege of Acre in 1191, fewer than 30 Scorpion teams accounted for over 800 casualties among the defending forces. The defenders' morning roll call became less about who was present and more about who hadn't been ventilated overnight. The psychological impact extended beyond the casualties inflicted. Defenders forced to man walls under scorpion fire suffered severe morale problems. The knowledge that at any moment an unseen projectile could end your life created what medieval chronicles described as the waiting death, a paralyzing anxiety that undermined defensive efforts more effectively than direct attacks. This psychological warfare aspect made the scorpion a valuable siege weapon even when its physical damage to structures remained limited. Some besieged cities even reported cases of scorpion fever, a nervous condition where defenders constantly ducked at shadows and flinched at every sound. Nothing ruins your concentration quite like wondering if your head is about to become the next pincushion for a projectile fired by someone who might be enjoying lunch while they shoot at you. While the scorpion brought precision death from unprecedented distances, medieval military engineers were simultaneously developing weapons of truly massive destructive potential. If medieval siege weaponry had a royal family, the trebuchet would sit on the throne. This colossal engine of destruction represented the absolute pinnacle of pre-gunpowder artillery, capable of hurling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over incredible distances with devastating effect. Where the scorpion killed with precision, the trebuchet killed with raw, overwhelming force. The trebuchet operated on a counterweight system that would make any physics teacher proud. A massive weight, often exceeding 7,000 pounds, hung from the short end of a long wooden arm. When this weight dropped, it forced the longer end of the arm upward at tremendous speed, launching whatever projectile happened to be loaded in its sling. This simple mechanism could propel a 200-pound stone over 300 meters with enough force to shatter castle walls upon impact. Castle architects who thought they'd built impenetrable fortifications discovered the hard way that their unbreakable walls were merely not yet broken. The trebuchet had a way of transforming even the most confident castle defender into an anxious house hunter. Medieval engineering reached its zenith in these massive weapons. The largest documented trebuchets required teams of up to 60 men to operate and could launch projectiles weighing over 300 pounds. Contemporary accounts describe the earth-shaking impact of these massive stones, with one chronicler noting that a direct hit on a tower reduced it to dust and splinters as if it had never existed. Castle dwellers learned to dread the distinctive creaking sound of a trebuchet being winched back. It was the medieval equivalent of hearing a bomb bay door opening directly above your home. Trebuchet ammunition showed medieval creativity at its most disturbingly innovative. While stones remained the standard projectile, besieging armies often got creative when psychological warfare seemed advantageous. Historical records document trebuchets launching diseased animal carcasses, severed human heads, and even live prisoners into besieged cities. One particularly notorious incident during the siege of Kaffa in 1347 involved catapulting plague victims over the walls, possibly contributing to the spread of the Black Death into Europe. Medieval biological warfare lacked subtlety, but certainly made an impression. Nothing says surrender now quite like having your neighbor's deceased relative raining down from the sky. The exceptional range and power of these weapons transformed siege warfare. Before the trebuchet, defenders behind strong walls could reasonably expect to outlast most besiegers. After its introduction, no wall was truly safe, no fortress truly secure. This psychological advantage often proved as valuable as the physical damage inflicted, with many cities surrendering at the mere sight of trebuchets being assembled outside their walls. When your enemy started building what looked like an enormous wooden middle finger pointed at your fortifications, it was usually time to reconsider your life choices. While these 10 weapons represent the height of medieval military technology, they also reveal how human ingenuity has always found expression even in the art of warfare. From simple clubs with spikes to massive engines of destruction, the evolution of these weapons tells a story of innovation driven by one of humanity's oldest and darkest activities. Speaking of impressive heating methods, let's talk about one of their coolest, or should I say warmest, inventions, the medieval hearth. It wasn't just some basic fireplace, it was the beating heart of every home, literally. Unlike our modern fireplaces tucked away in corners like shy teenagers at a school dance, medieval hearths stood proudly in the center of the main room. And boy, did they know what they were doing with this setup. Here's what made these hearths absolute genius. They worked with the entire house to create a natural heating system. The stones around and under the hearth would soak up heat during the day like a giant hot water bottle. Then, just like that friend who never knows when to leave a party, these stones would keep radiating warmth long after the fire died down. Some medieval buildings even had stones that stayed warm for up to 12 hours after the fire went out. The smoke was actually part of their master plan too. Instead of rushing up a chimney, which many houses didn't even have, it would slowly find its way out through gaps in the roof. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this smoke acted like a natural pest control system, keeping bugs out of the timbers and helping preserve food hanging from the rafters. Talk about killing two birds with one stone. Though I guess nowadays we'd say feeding two birds with one scone to be more politically correct. Recent studies of surviving medieval houses showed these central hearths could heat spaces up to 600 square feet effectively. That's about the size of a modern apartment. And get this, the stone floors around these hearths have been found with scorch marks from being constantly heated to temperatures over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Makes my attempts at heating up leftover pizza look pretty amateur in comparison. But what about those times when even the mighty hearth wasn't enough? Well, that's where the medieval folks got really creative with their community solutions. Speaking of which, wait until you hear about their ingenious communal fires. Because while we might complain about our neighbors today, medieval folks actually needed their neighbors, especially during winter. The whole "it takes a village" thing wasn't just a saying back then, it was their heating strategy. Every village had these amazing communal fire spots where people would gather to stay warm. And honestly, they sound way better than my neighborhood's HOA meetings. These communal fires were usually set up in the village square or a dedicated building called a warming house. And before you start thinking it was just a boring fire pit, these places were the medieval equivalent of our coffee shops, community centers, and social media all rolled into one. People would bring their work, share news, aka medieval Facebook, and even cook together. Historians found records showing some villages maintained these fires 24/7 during winter months, with families taking turns to keep them going. Here's something wild. Archaeologists discovered that these communal warming houses were strategically placed so that smoke would blow away from the village's main areas. These medieval engineers weren't messing around. They even calculated that a typical village warming house could serve up to 50 people at once, which is more efficient than running 50 separate home fires. Talk about medieval energy conservation. The best part? These spots created a real sense of community. People would share stories, arrange marriages, and even hold court sessions there. One historian found a record from 1267 where a village solved a property dispute over a chicken while warming their toes by the communal fire. Now that's what I call killing two birds with one. Well, maybe I shouldn't finish that saying given the chicken situation, but sometimes you couldn't make it to the communal fire, or maybe you just didn't feel like listening to Mrs. Johnson from 2 houses down talk about her prize-winning turnips again. That's when personal heating solutions came in handy, like these clever little hand warmers and pocket stones, because personal heating in medieval times was like carrying around your own tiny furnace, except way cooler. These folks invented portable heating before portable anything was even a thing. Instead of those chemical hand warmers we use today for camping, medieval people carried heated stones and metal containers filled with hot coals. They were basically walking around with their own little pieces of their hearth. The most popular hand warmers were called chaufferettes, fancy French name for what was essentially a metal ball with holes in it. You'd fill these bad boys with hot coals and carry them in your pockets or muffs. Rich people had super fancy ones made of silver or gold, while regular folks used iron or copper. One medieval merchant's inventory from 1378 listed over 30 different types of hand warmers. Talk about product variety. The pocket stones were even more interesting. They'd heat these smooth river stones by the fire until they were toasty warm, then wrap them in bits of cloth. Archaeological digs have found thousands of these stones with telltale wear patterns from being constantly handled and reheated. Some even had little grooves worn into them from being carried in the same pocket day after day. Makes my phone's wear patterns look pretty boring in comparison. But here's where it gets really clever. They didn't just use these for their hands. People would put heated stones in their boots, tuck them into their clothes, or even use them to warm up their beds before sleeping. There's this hilarious court record from 1422 where a man got in trouble for accidentally taking someone else's heated stone at a church service. Apparently, stone warming theft was a real crime back then. The punishment? He had to provide heated stones for the entire congregation for the rest of winter. Some doctors even prescribed specific types of stones for different ailments. Got a stomachache? Here's a flat stone. Sore back? Try this curved one. It was like the medieval version of a heating pad prescription. The funny part is, modern science shows they weren't totally wrong. Heat therapy actually does help with certain types of pain. And when personal heating wasn't quite enough, medieval folks turned to an even more interesting source of warmth: their furry friends. But I'm not talking about cats and dogs here. The medieval solution for home heating involves some much bigger animals. In fact, you might be wondering why medieval barns were often connected to houses. Well, it wasn't because farmers were too lazy to walk outside. They were actually using their livestock as living, breathing furnaces. A single cow gives off as much heat as a small space heater, about 1,000 BTUs per hour. Now multiply that by 5 or 6 cows, throw in a couple of sheep, and you've got yourself a serious heating system. Medieval farmers would build their homes with a clever setup. The living areas would share a wall with the animal barn, usually on the north side, to block those chilly winds. The animal's body heat would seep through the walls, creating a natural warming effect. It's like having a bunch of space heaters that also produce milk and wool. Studies of surviving medieval farmhouses showed that rooms sharing walls with animal pens stayed about 10 degrees warmer than other rooms. The best part? These animals were basically self-maintaining heaters. Feed them some hay and they'd keep pumping out warmth all night long. Sure, the smell wasn't great. Medieval air fresheners weren't really a thing, but I guess when you're freezing, a little farm fragrance is better than turning into a human icicle. One medieval text from 1382 actually gives specific instructions about which animals make the best heaters. Cows were top tier, followed by horses, while chickens, well, let's just say they were the medieval equivalent of those tiny USB heaters that barely work. There's even a record of a landlord in 1415 who charged less rent for houses that didn't share a wall with the barn. Medieval real estate's first heating included discount. But what about folks who couldn't handle the barnyard aromatherapy? Well, they got pretty creative with their next heating solution. Using some seriously smart science, even though they didn't know it was science, they figured out how to make fire work twice as hard using reflectors. Because long before anyone knew about the physics of heat reflection, these clever folks discovered that shiny metal plates and polished stone surfaces could bounce heat back into a room like a basketball player making a perfect pass. The most common reflectors were made from polished brass or copper sheets, strategically placed around fireplaces and cooking areas. These weren't your average bathroom mirrors. We're talking about massive metal plates, some as big as dining tables. Archaeological finds show that by the 14th century, some wealthy homes had entire walls covered in polished metal panels. Talk about medieval bling with a purpose. The science behind it is pretty impressive. Tests on recreated medieval reflectors showed they could increase a room's temperature by up to 30%. That's like getting a third more heat from the same amount of firewood. And these folks figured this out centuries before anyone understood how heat radiation worked. My high school physics teacher would have been impressed. Here's a fun fact. One medieval castle in France had silver-plated walls in its great hall. The lord who installed them wasn't just showing off his wealth, he was actually creating a massive heat reflector system. Though, I bet explaining that to the tax collector was interesting. No, really, the silver walls are for heating, not just to make my neighbors jealous. The best part? They discovered that curved reflectors worked even better than flat ones. Some clever medieval engineers even designed corner fireplaces with curved metal backs that could spread heat across an entire room. It's like they invented medieval surround sound, but for heat. These curved reflectors were so effective that some medieval documents show people actually complained about rooms being too hot. Now that's a winter problem we'd love to have. Records from a monastery in 1388 mention a particularly clever setup where they used a series of angled reflectors to direct heat into the monastery's infirmary, creating what we'd now call targeted heating zones. The monks called it God's mirrors, though I'm pretty sure God was more impressed with their prayers than their heating system. But what about those cold winter nights when even the fanciest reflectors couldn't quite cut it? That's when medieval folks broke out their secret weapon for a cozy night's sleep. The bed warmer, aka the medieval electric blanket, was pure genius in its simplicity. A long-handled copper or brass pan filled with hot coals would be slid between the sheets like a giant warm sandwich filling. These warming pans weren't just practical, they were often beautifully decorated with patterns and designs, making them the medieval equivalent of those fancy gadgets we keep in our kitchens today. Each pan could hold enough hot coals to keep a bed toasty for about 2 to 3 hours, which was usually enough time to fall into a cozy sleep. Rich people would have servants warm their beds for them, while common folks would do the coal shuffling themselves. Fun fact, archaeologists found one pan from 1435 with "Sweet dreams, don't let the ice bite" engraved on its handle. Seems like medieval folks had a sense of humor about their chilly nights. But here's where it gets interesting. They had a whole system worked out. The coals would be carefully selected from the evening fire, with the best ones saved for bed warming. Why? Because nobody wanted to wake up to smoky sheets or, worse, a fire. Records show that some towns actually had special bed warmer inspectors whose job was to make sure people weren't using dangerous coals. Talk about a weird job title to put on your medieval LinkedIn. A single warming pan could raise bed temperatures by about 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to turn a freezing bed into a cozy nest. Some clever folks even developed a rotation system using multiple pans throughout the night. One historical document mentions a particularly cold winter in 1442 when a nobleman used 6 different warming pans to keep his massive bed heated. That's what I call high-maintenance sleeping. But for those who couldn't afford fancy warming pans or didn't trust themselves not to set their beds on fire, there was another solution that helped keep the warmth in while they slept. Enter the canopy bed, and trust me, it wasn't just about looking fancy. Because canopy beds weren't just medieval interior designers showing off, they were actually brilliant heat traps. The heavy curtains around these beds worked like a personal sleeping bag, keeping your body heat from escaping into the cold room. Records show these beds could maintain temperatures up to 15 degrees warmer than the rest of the room, making them the original sleep pods. Medieval carpenters became experts at designing these beds for maximum warmth. The best ones had double-layered curtains and a covered top that created a mini room within the room. Some even had special slots built into the posts to hold those bed warmers we talked about earlier. Talk about medieval smart home technology. The funny thing is, people started competing over who had the fanciest bed curtains. One record from 1389 mentions a merchant who spent more on his bed curtains than his house. Now that's what I call mixed-up priorities. But at least he was warm. Scientists tested a recreated medieval canopy bed and found that with all curtains closed, it only took about 10 minutes for body heat to create a cozy microclimate inside. But what about staying warm during the day? Well, medieval builders had another trick up their sleeves. They turned their attention to something we still use today, the power of the sun. And they were way better at using it than most modern architects. Because these medieval builders were basically solar power pioneers, just without the fancy panels. They figured out that if you built a house with big windows facing south, you could trap the sun's heat like a champ. These weren't your regular windows either. They were strategically placed to catch the low winter sun while staying shady during summer. It's like they invented seasonal temperature control before air conditioning was even a dream. The real genius came from how they used stone walls. They'd build these thick walls that would soak up heat during the day and slowly release it at night, like a stone hot water bottle. Tests on surviving medieval buildings showed these walls could store enough heat to keep rooms warm for up to 8 hours after sunset. Some castles even had special sunrooms with walls up to 6 feet thick. Now, that's what I call extreme insulation. You know those modern passive solar homes everyone's talking about? Turns out medieval builders beat them to it by about 800 years. Archaeological studies found that some medieval houses were angled exactly 17.5 degrees east of true south, the perfect position for maximum sun exposure during winter. And here I am, still trying to figure out which way is north on my phone's compass. A particularly clever lord in 1356 had his great hall built with different sized windows on each floor. The bottom windows were smaller to prevent heat loss, while the top ones were huge sun catchers. His servants probably thought he was crazy, but energy bills weren't exactly a thing back then, were they? But sometimes even the smartest sun-catching tricks weren't enough to keep out the cold. That's when medieval builders would look up, way up, to their next heating solution, those seemingly simple thatched roofs. Weren't just medieval folks trying to look rustic, They were actually incredible natural insulators. Pack straw creates thousands of tiny air pockets that trap heat, working just like modern home insulation. But unlike that pink stuff in our attics today, these roofs were completely natural and lasted for decades. A well-made thatched roof could be up to 2 feet thick, and tests show they were better at keeping heat in than most modern roofing materials. The really wild part? These roofs actually breathed. They'd let just enough moisture escape to prevent mold while keeping all the warm air inside. A properly thatched roof could reduce heat loss by up to 50% compared to other medieval roofing options. One medieval record from 1397 mentions a particularly snowy winter where thatched houses stayed so warm the inhabitants had to open their windows. In January. Meanwhile, their tile-roof neighbors were probably huddled around their fires, wondering what kind of magic was happening next door. But the best invention for staying warm during those long winter nights? Well, that came from some seriously creative thinking about where to put hot rocks. These medieval heating engineers had one last trick up their sleeves, and it involved turning the floor into a giant heating pad. Because here's the thing about really big stones. They hold on to heat like teenagers hold on to their phones. Medieval people discovered that if you heated up large stones in a fire and then tucked them under the floorboards, they'd radiate warmth for hours. It was like having heated floors before heated floors were cool. A typical setup would use stones weighing between 20 to 30 pounds each. They'd heat these bad boys up during the day, then slide them into special slots under the wooden floors or benches. Tests on similar stones showed they could stay warm for up to 6 hours. And get this, some medieval houses had dedicated stone warming pits built right into their kitchens, like a prehistoric microwave just for rocks. The really fancy places even had stone warming schedules. Documents from one 15th century manor house show they rotated 24 stones throughout the day, with servants switching them out every 4 hours. Talk about a hot job. Scientists estimate this system could maintain room temperatures around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius, even when it was freezing outside. One monk wrote in 1403 about how they used this trick in the monastery's infirmary. He called it God's own heating. Though I'm pretty sure God would have just invented central heating if he was directly involved in medieval architecture. And there you have it, 10 genius medieval heating methods that put our modern solutions to shame. Makes you wonder what other brilliant ideas we've forgotten over the centuries, doesn't it? Maybe it's time to bring some of these back. Minus the barnyard smells, of course. One of the most trusted ways to fight rats was simple. Get a cat. But not just any cat. A good mouser was a treasure with 4 legs. In the 1300s, during the time of the Black Death, some cats were so prized they sold for what would be hundreds of dollars today. These were the original security systems, silent, sharp, and never asking for overtime. Stealing one wasn't just rude. In some places, it could actually get you in trouble with the local law. Medieval peasants knew that not all cats were equal rat catchers. The best weren't those fancy cat nobility kept, but scruffy ones with quick reflexes, sharp claws, and what they called the hunter's eye. That intense stare that meant business. The top mousers typically had stocky bodies and short tails, perfect for chasing rodents through tight spaces. Some towns even kept records of the best rat-catching cats. A particularly talented mouser might earn its owner tax breaks or special privileges. One record mentions a cat who caught over 50 rats in a single month, earning its owner free ale at the local tavern. That cat wasn't just a hunter, it was a walking, purring meal ticket. Peasants tested kittens by watching how they reacted to moving objects. Quick pounces meant a keeper. Slow or uninterested kittens were given away. A lazy cat was just another mouth to feed, something most peasant families couldn't afford. A medieval cat couldn't get away with just being cute. It needed a killer resume, literally. They rewarded successful hunts with treats and sometimes released mice in barns for practice. Our next mousers were so valuable that peasants would lock them up at night. Trained ferrets became the secret weapon for getting rid of rats that hid in places too small for cats to reach. These slender, tube-shaped creatures might seem like odd choices for pest control, but their long, flexible bodies made them perfect for the job. Medieval peasants valued ferrets for their ability to squeeze into tight spaces where rats made their homes. Unlike cats, which hunted on their own terms, ferrets required training and handling. A well-trained ferret could be sent directly into rat holes, burrows, and spaces between walls. These little hunters were basically the medieval version of snake cameras, except they came back with dead rats instead of plumbing problems. Training a ferret wasn't simple. Young ferrets had to be taught to return to their handlers after being sent into a hole. Peasants often tied a small bell or piece of cloth to their ferrets so they could track where they went. What made ferrets especially valuable was their determination. Once on the scent of a rat, a ferret would pursue it relentlessly through passages no human or cat could access. Medieval records show that a single ferret could clear a small granary of rats in just a few hours. Ferrets earned their keep not just by killing rats, but also by creating absolute panic in the rodent population. Rats would flee in terror when they smelled a ferret, often running straight into waiting traps or the paws of cats stationed at exit holes. While ferrets tackled the rats hiding in walls and underground, some peasants turned to another approach that didn't require feeding or training at all. Spicy herbs and strong-smelling plants scattered around homes became medieval rat-repellent spray before spray was even invented. Peasants discovered that rats hated certain smells that humans found pleasant or tolerable. Turns out rats were the original picky roommates with sensitive noses. Mint leaves topped the list of rat-repelling plants. Peasants would crush fresh mint and sprinkle it around doorways and windows. The strong menthol smell was apparently rat kryptonite. Rats smelled mint and thought, nope, not going in there. Smells like someone's trying way too hard with medieval breath freshener. Garlic came in as a close second favorite. Crushed cloves were placed in corners of grain storage areas and kitchens. The sulfur compounds in garlic drove rats crazy, and not in a good way. Rats avoided garlic like teenagers avoid chores. Some clever medieval farmers would soak rags in garlic juice and hang them from rafters, creating a smell barrier that rats refused to cross. Wormwood, a bitter herb still used to make absinthe today, proved especially effective. Its intensely bitter compounds were unbearable to rats, though humans didn't exactly throw wormwood-smelling parties either. Most peasants preferred the sharp smell of wormwood to the disease-carrying pests themselves. Mustard seeds ground into powder and sprinkled across thresholds created another line of defense. The spicy, pungent aroma that gives mustard its kick was too much for sensitive rat noses. Medieval rats would rather starve than walk through what basically amounted to a medieval hot sauce obstacle course. One medieval manuscript from the 1400s lists a special mix: equal parts mint, garlic, wormwood, and ground mustard seed, all mixed with a bit of vinegar. This potent mixture was their version of super-strength rat repellent. The smell was probably strong enough to make even the rats need those little medieval handkerchiefs. For peasants who couldn't afford a good mousing cat or didn't have access to trained ferrets, these spicy solutions were a godsend. These herb barriers served double duty in medieval homes, keeping away rats while masking the smell of unwashed peasants at the same time. When herbs weren't enough, though, some turned to solutions that weren't just unpleasant, but downright deadly. Rat poison in medieval times wasn't some carefully measured scientific formula. It was a wild mix of whatever deadly stuff peasants could get their hands on. From arsenic-rich minerals to hemlock plants and even ground glass, medieval DIY poison was as dangerous as it was creative. When your pest control might kill your family too, you know you're really committed to the cause. Most poison recipes were passed down through generations by word of mouth. One 1200s manuscript describes mixing ground hemlock with honey to create baits that rats would eagerly consume. The writer included a warning to keep it away from children and pets, medieval for "this stuff will absolutely kill everything." Arsenic topped the medieval toxic ingredient list when available. Peasants would collect white arsenic powder from mineral deposits or buy it from merchants. Mixed with fat or cheese, it created deadly rat bait. Medieval rats probably wondered why their friends kept dropping dead at the all-you-can-eat cheese buffet. Frank was fine until he hit that third helping of Gouda. Ground glass and rat poison might sound bizarre today, but medieval folks believed tiny glass fragments would tear up a rat's insides. Must have been reassuring at medieval dinner parties. Is that seasoning on my stew, or are you trying to murder rats and guests with the same recipe? The dangers were enormous. Accidental poisonings happened frequently, especially among children and pets. One French record from 1329 tells of an entire household sickened after rats dragged poisoned bait into the family's flour storage. Nothing says family dinner like everyone suddenly developing mysterious stomach pains. Village authorities sometimes banned certain poisons after particularly bad incidents. A 1400s English town record prohibits arsenic rat baits after 3 children died in 1 month. Still, with rats destroying precious food supplies, many peasants continued the practice secretly, like medieval Breaking Bad, but with worse chemistry skills. While poison could kill many rats, it rarely eliminated them completely. For every rat that died, foaming at the mouth, others bred rapidly to replace it. This limitation led medieval people to develop other methods that didn't risk killing everything in the household. Pit traps became a popular rat-catching method among medieval peasants who wanted something safer than poison, but still effective. The concept was brilliantly simple. Dig small holes in areas where rats frequently traveled, disguise the opening, and wait for the unsuspecting rodents to fall in. These traps were popular because they were effective, safe, and cost almost nothing to make. Medieval households typically placed these traps along walls, in corners of grain storage areas, or near known rat holes. The pits didn't need to be deep. Just 6 to 8 inches was usually enough to prevent rats from jumping out. The real trick was in the design of the pit's interior. Smart trappers would line the bottom and sides with materials that made climbing impossible for tiny rat claws. Clay was a common lining material because when smoothed and allowed to dry, it created a slippery surface that rats couldn't grip. Watching a rat try to climb slick clay walls was medieval entertainment before Netflix, complete with dramatic falls and failed escape attempts. Some peasants used animal fat or plant oils to grease the sides of unlined pits, creating an equally challenging escape route. Children were often assigned the task of checking the pits each morning, a chore that combined pest control with entertainment. A record from a 1340s English manor notes that during one particularly bad rat infestation, a system of 20 pits throughout the property caught over 60 rats in a single week. The beauty of pit traps lay in their reusability. Once emptied of rats, the same pit could be reset immediately with minimal effort. Medieval budget spreadsheets would have shown excellent ROI on pit traps, if spreadsheets or budgets had existed back then. Some clever medieval trappers enhanced their pits with additions that increased catch rates. One technique involved placing a thin stick across the pit with food balanced in the middle. When a rat tried to cross the stick to reach the food, its weight would cause the stick to spin, dropping the rat into the pit below. Nothing said, "I hate my neighbor" in medieval times, quite like dumping a bucket of live rats over their fence at night. While pit traps worked well for ground-dwelling rats, medieval people needed other solutions for the clever rodents that preferred high places. This led to some interesting innovations that made use of something completely different. Sound-based rat repellents might seem like a modern invention, but medieval peasants created their own versions of noisemakers and whistles specifically designed to drive away rodents. At first glance, the idea of scaring away rats with noise might seem silly, but there was actual wisdom behind this seemingly strange approach to pest control. The concept was based on observations that rats would flee from sudden, unfamiliar sounds. Medieval peasants noticed that rats disappeared during loud celebrations or when metal workers were hammering nearby. Some clever folks put 2 and 2 together and realized that creating specific noises could help keep rats away from homes and food storage areas. One common device was the rat whistle, typically made from hollowed reeds or bird bones with holes carved into specific positions. When blown, these whistles produced high-pitched sounds that humans could barely hear but drove rats crazy. Medieval rat whistlers must have looked ridiculous, standing in their barns at sunrise, blowing on bone flutes like deranged pipers with an audience of 0 humans and hopefully 0 rats. Manuscripts from the 1200s describe rat pipes that were played near granaries before opening them. The high-pitched sound would send any rats inside scurrying for the exits where they could be caught by waiting dogs or cats. Some villages even had designated rat pipers who would make rounds through storage areas once weekly, playing their specialized instruments. Metal noisemakers were another popular option. Simple devices made from thin copper or iron sheets would be hung from ceilings on strings. When the wind blew or someone walked by, they would clatter together, creating unpredictable noises that kept rats on edge. The constant clanging probably kept the humans on edge too. Medieval homes must have sounded like someone dropping pots and pans every few minutes. Did these sound-based methods actually work? Modern science suggests they might have had some merit. Rats have sensitive hearing and can detect frequencies far beyond human range. Sudden, unpredictable noises do cause stress responses in rodents and can discourage them from settling in a particular area. The methods were certainly less dangerous than poison and less work than maintaining a cat or ferret. Many peasant families developed specific rat-scaring rituals, like banging pots together before entering food storage areas or stomping heavily near known rat nests. Children were often tasked with making these noises, turning pest control into a noisy game. One 1400s household guides recommend that children march through storage areas each evening, making the loudest racket possible to keep rats away during the night. Rats can actually adapt to predictable noises over time, so changing up the sounds was important. Medieval pest control experts, if such a job had existed, would have given one-star reviews to families that used the same banging pattern day after day. Your rat-scaring technique lacks creativity, and your rhythmic banging has basically become rodent lullaby music. The downside? Neighbors. Living next to someone who believes strongly in noise-based rat control must have been a special kind of medieval torture. Village records occasionally mention disputes between neighbors over excessive rat-scaring noise, especially at night. While sound offered a creative approach to keeping rats at bay, medieval people also tried to trick the rodents using a completely different strategy. Fake predators and scare toys were a creative medieval strategy for keeping rats away by playing on their natural fears. Just like modern gardeners might place a plastic owl to scare away birds, medieval peasants carved wooden animals that resembled the natural enemies of rats. These silent guardians were thought to trick rodents into believing a deadly predator was nearby. Wooden owls were among the most popular rat-scaring decoys. Carved from a single piece of wood, these owls ranged from crude, basic shapes to impressively detailed sculptures with painted features. The best carvers would add real feathers to enhance the realism. Medieval product review for wooden owl decoys: 5 stars. Rats disappeared for 2 whole days. 3 stars off because they came back, and 1 chewed the owl's face off. Would buy again. Wooden or clay snakes were another common choice. These were often painted with patterns resembling local snake species known to hunt rats. Some clever peasants would position these fake snakes partly hidden under straw or in dark corners, making them seem more realistic and threatening. Did these fake predators actually work? Surprisingly, they might have, at least temporarily. Rats do have instinctive fears of predator shapes, especially when they're unfamiliar. However, rats are intelligent creatures and quickly learned which threats were real and which were just wood. This led to an interesting arms race between humans and rats. Medieval rat scarers had to regularly move their decoys around to maintain the illusion. Medieval interior decorating driven entirely by rodent psychology. Records show that some households rotated different types of decoys weekly to prevent rats from getting too comfortable. Some creative peasants took the idea further by creating motion-activated scare toys. A 1400s German manuscript describes a pivoting wooden hawk that would rock back and forth when the wind blew through a window. The most amusing aspect of these fake predators was how they sometimes backfired. Rats would eventually recognize the decoys as harmless and would occasionally nest right beside them or even gnaw on them. One medieval account describes a wooden owl that became so damaged by rat teeth that it looked more like a plucked chicken than a fearsome hunter. When even the most fearsome wooden predator failed to keep rats away, medieval peasants turned to an even more primal approach. Human hair, urine, and other bodily byproducts became surprisingly effective rat repellents in medieval times. The entire concept might make your nose wrinkle, but medieval folks weren't afraid to get gross if it meant keeping their food supplies safe. This approach was based on the belief that rats generally avoided areas with strong human scents, likely due to their instinctive fear of people as predators. Hair collected from combs or during haircuts was carefully saved instead of being thrown away. Peasants would stuff this hair into small cloth bags and place them around food storage areas, in corners of homes, or near suspected rat entry points. Medieval household guides recommend changing these hair packets monthly to maintain their effectiveness. Urine, yes, actual human pee, was considered among the most powerful rat repellents available. Medieval chamber pots got a second career as pest control devices. Cloth soaked in urine would be placed in strategic locations, usually outside entrance points to buildings. Some households even designated specific corners of their property where family members should urinate to create a rat-repelling perimeter. A 1400s text recommends male urine over female, claiming it contained stronger scents that rats found more threatening. The document further suggests that urine collected after eating strong-smelling foods like garlic worked best. Fingernail clippings joined the arsenal of human-derived rat repellents. These would be scattered in small piles near food storage areas. Rats apparently drew the line at hanging around human nail salons. Sweat-soaked clothing items were also repurposed as rat deterrents. Work clothes worn during hard physical labor would be cut into strips and hung near doorways or windows. The effectiveness of these methods likely varied. Rats do have strong instinctive reactions to predator scents, including humans. However, hungry rats in winter might ignore even the strongest human smells if food was scarce enough. Still, these methods cost nothing and were easily implemented, making them popular among the poorest peasants. While these smelly solutions helped keep rats away from certain areas, medieval people also realized that the best way to deal with rats was to prevent them from accessing food altogether. This led to some extremely clever and practical innovations. Smarter storage methods became one of the most effective ways medieval peasants protected their precious food supplies from hungry rats. Rather than simply trying to kill or repel rats, these clever techniques focused on making food completely inaccessible to the rodents in the first place. As the saying went in many medieval villages, a rat that can't reach can't eat. The simplest and most common approach was to hang food in sacks from ceiling beams. Grain, dried meat, and other preserved foods would be placed in sturdy cloth bags, then suspended high above the ground using ropes. The height alone deterred most rats, but medieval peasants didn't stop there. They added extra protection by placing metal discs on the ropes, similar to modern squirrel guards on bird feeders. Medieval architects never planned for hanging food storage, leaving many peasants with the original ceiling fan, a sack of grain swinging dangerously over dinner. Sealed containers provided another layer of defense. Clay pots with tight-fitting lids were common, often sealed with beeswax or pitch around the edges. Wooden chests for storing bread and flour might have their seams sealed with pine resin, creating an airtight and rat-proof barrier. For larger food stores, many households built elevated platforms on legs. These platforms would stand several feet off the ground, with each leg topped by a wide wooden or metal disc that rats couldn't navigate around. Rats looking up at these food fortresses must have felt like medieval soldiers facing a castle without siege equipment. Perhaps the most innovative solution was the greased pole storage system. Smooth wooden poles would be coated with animal fat, then placed upright with food platforms at the top. Rats, despite their impressive climbing abilities, couldn't maintain their grip on the slick surface. The effectiveness of these methods is evident in records from medieval manors and monasteries. One monastery record from the 1400s notes that after implementing suspended storage systems, grain losses decreased from nearly 20% to less than 5% per year. While these smarter storage solutions proved highly effective, they weren't perfect. During severe famines or particularly harsh winters, desperate rats would attempt increasingly bold strategies to reach food. When all other methods failed, some medieval peasants turned to a solution that might seem shocking to modern sensibilities. Eating rats was a desperate but practical solution during the harshest times in medieval Europe. When famine struck and hunger gnawed, some peasants turned pests into protein, from nuisance to necessary nutrition, medieval recycling at its most extreme. During severe famines, rats were actively hunted for food. Several chronicles mention communities cooking rats, with one 1300s account describing how even the vermin became precious when bread was but a memory. The most common cooking method was simple stewing with available vegetables and herbs. What meat is this? Forest chicken. Very rare forest chicken. An average brown rat weighs about half a pound. Not impressive by modern standards, but significant to a starving medieval family. Some terrible famine years saw rat meat openly sold in markets, sometimes at prices higher than chicken. Medieval medical texts acknowledged rat meat's nutritional value while recommending thorough cooking. Medieval five-star restaurant review: the rat was cooked to perfection, would starve again. Medieval food safety tip: if your rat meat is still squeaking, it needs more time on the fire. The practice disappeared as food security improved in later centuries, standing as evidence of the extreme measures medieval people took when facing hardship. Think medieval castles were just boring old stone fortresses? Think again. These ancient strongholds hide 10 mind-blowing secrets that will change everything you thought you knew. The lords and ladies who lived in castles wanted comfort just as much as protection. While the outer walls were all business with arrow slits and murder holes, the inner chambers were a world of color and luxury. Walls that look bare today were once covered in vibrant painted scenes with reds, blues, and golds. Comfort was key for these medieval elites. Their floors featured imported fancy tiles from across Europe, creating beautiful patterns. The finest castles had glass windows when glass cost more than gold by weight. Most regular folks had to choose between freezing with open windows or suffocating with wooden shutters. Meanwhile, castle dwellers were basically living in medieval greenhouses. Those massive fireplaces you see in castle ruins could burn entire trees and were kept going day and night during winter. Enormous tapestries hung on walls weren't just decorative. They were medieval insulation, keeping drafts at bay in rooms big enough to fit 3 modern houses. The Great Hall hosted everything from royal feasts to legal proceedings. Tables could stretch nearly 100 feet with strict seating arrangements where moving one seat closer to the Lord was considered a major promotion. Nothing says, "I'm royalty," quite like trying to enjoy your expensive imported wine while dodging dive-bombing pigeons that flew in through the smoke holes. Even the most luxurious castles never forgot their military purpose. Beautiful arched windows were set high enough that arrows couldn't easily fly in. Decorative carvings often hid defensive features. Even dining arrangements were strategic. Trusted advisors sat with their backs to walls, while suspicious guests were placed where they could be watched. Castle builders were really smart about mixing deadly useful features with showing off luxury everywhere. And these clever designs were in every corner of these amazing buildings, including some surprising building tricks that helped the people inside win fights. Ever wonder why castle staircases always make you dizzy? It wasn't just bad medieval architecture, it was medieval battle strategy at its finest. Look at any old castle spiral staircase and you'll notice they almost always twist clockwise going up. This wasn't random, it was a fighting hack. Since most attackers were right-handed, this design forced them to fight with their sword arms squished against the center column. Their sword swings ended up about as effective as trying to do karate in a phone booth. Meanwhile, defenders coming down the stairs had their right arms on the outside of the spiral with plenty of room to swing. Home field advantage has never been so literal. Some castles took this sneakiness even further. They built steps of slightly different heights throughout the same staircase. The people who lived there knew exactly which steps were wonky, but invaders didn't. One wrong step, and you'd tumble down the stairs faster than a medieval knight after 8 cups of mead. The original TripAdvisor was actually a castle architect. In Conwy Castle in Wales, you can still see worn spots on the spiral stairs where people have stepped in the exact same safe places for over 700 years. That's the world's oldest continuous watch your step warning. The really clever bit? Some castles had a few special staircases that turned the opposite way, counterclockwise. These were built specifically for left-handed defenders. About 1 in 10 medieval knights were lefties, just like today. Left-handed fighters were sometimes especially valued in castle defense, medieval warfare's first southpaw advantage long before baseball existed. These twisted staircases weren't just architectural features, they were built-in weapons that could mean the difference between life and death. And while these sneaky stairs kept unwanted visitors from getting in, the castle walls themselves held another secret. Thick walls did more than just protect castles, they often hid secret chambers that few people knew about. Castle walls could be up to 12 feet thick, with plenty of space to hide entire rooms between the inner and outer stone faces. Finding the entrances was nearly impossible unless you knew the secret. Some opened when you pulled a certain candle holder or touched a specific stone. Others hid behind moving wooden panels that looked like normal wall decorations. In one famous castle in Europe, a hidden passage connected to caves that brought in food during attacks, which explained why the defenders never ran out of supplies. These hidden spaces served different jobs around the castle. Many were escape routes with tunnels leading outside to safety. When unwanted guests showed up without warning, castle owners suddenly remembered urgent business requiring the secret exit tunnel. Some chambers were listening spots where castle lords could hear what visitors said when they thought nobody was around. Tiny holes and decorative wall carvings let sound travel to hidden rooms where someone could listen to every word. Hidden treasure rooms were very common. When danger came, gold coins and jewels would disappear into wall spaces that looked like solid stone from outside. These hiding spots worked so well that some treasures stayed lost for hundreds of years. A person fixing an old castle wall in France found 400 gold coins worth over $900,000 that had been hidden since the 1600s. The darkest secret rooms were prison cells called oubliettes, from a word meaning to forget, because once someone went in, they were meant to be forgotten forever. These were often small spaces under trap doors where prisoners could be dropped and abandoned. Medieval castle builders knew how to keep secrets. They created the first private chat rooms centuries before the internet existed. Modern tools like radar still find new hidden rooms in old castles today, proving that many secrets remain undiscovered after hundreds of years. While these hidden spaces kept private things private, some castle features did the exact opposite. These medieval bathrooms were usually small rooms jutting out from castle walls, with everything dropping straight down through chutes to whatever was below, often the moat or just the ground. No toilet paper existed back then. Wealthy folk used wool or hemp, while others used leaves, moss, or their left hand. Medieval bathroom etiquette was simple. Left hand for wiping, right hand for eating, and both hands for praying. Nothing splashed back up. At Dover Castle, some garderobes emptied into a central shaft, dropping 60 feet into the ground. Castle designers tried to make things less smelly by placing toilets on the windy sides of castles. Some even had tiny windows for airflow. You know your plumbing is bad when your bathroom design depends on good weather. The truly bizarre part? Garderobe actually means clothes guard, because people stored their fancy clothes in these stinky bathroom spaces. They believed the awful smell would keep moths away from their expensive fabrics. Medieval fashion tip: if your outfit smells worse than the outhouse, you're doing formal wear correctly. During battles, these toilet chutes became a surprising weak point. Enemies sometimes climbed up the waste chutes to sneak into castles during sieges. Imagine wanting to conquer a castle so badly you'd climb through centuries of toilet waste. Talk about dedicated warriors. Long sieges created major bathroom problems. With hundreds of people trapped inside for months, garderobes would overflow. During the siege of Chateau Gaillard in 1204, defenders had to throw out the weakest people because they couldn't handle the waste situation. Waste dropped into a chute that opened outside the wall, often onto unsuspecting people. In medieval times, heads up wasn't just a friendly warning. It was survival advice when walking near castle walls. While castle toilet technology was pretty basic, at least their defensive entrances were much more advanced. Some drawbridges weren't just lifted, they were rigged to collapse on purpose. While most castle bridges simply went up and down, the clever medieval engineers designed special trap drawbridges with sections that could suddenly drop away. When enemy soldiers rushed across what looked like a normal bridge, defenders would pull hidden levers or cut ropes and, surprise, the middle would fall out. Nothing ruins a knight's day quite like the bridge disappearing beneath his feet mid-charge. At Caerphilly Castle, evidence shows their trap bridge could collapse in less than 2 seconds, barely enough time to say, "Oh no," before splashing into the moat. Other castles had tilt bridges that worked like giant seesaws, suddenly pivoting to slide attackers off into the water or onto spikes below. Medieval engineers basically invented the slip and slide, except theirs ended with spears instead of a pool. The real genius came when these trap bridges were combined with portcullises, those heavy spiked gates that dropped down from above. Attackers would charge across the bridge, then the portcullis would slam down behind them, trapping them between gates. At the same time, the bridge might collapse, cutting off their retreat. Once trapped in this murder box, defenders had plenty of options for dealing with the unwelcome guests. Arrow slits and holes in the ceiling let them shoot arrows or pour down boiling water, heated sand, or burning oil. It was like a deadly game show where getting eliminated was extremely literal. Harlech Castle took this to the extreme, with 6 different obstacles protecting its entrance. Multiple drawbridges, portcullises, and doors created a deadly obstacle course for attackers. While these clever bridges protected the front door with moving parts and sudden drops, the moats surrounding many castles weren't just filled with water. Creating a water moat meant finding a water source, building systems to keep it flowing, and dealing with freezing, flooding, and algae. That's a lot of work just to make a big puddle around your home. The cheaper option? Digging a ditch and filling it with all sorts of nasty surprises. Many dry moats contained wooden stakes pointing upward, thorn bushes, and caltrops, 4-pointed metal spikes that always landed with one point facing up. Medieval castle designers took "keep off the lawn" signs to a whole new level. The truly gross moats combined these obstacles with castle waste. Without proper plumbing, many castles dumped their garbage and sewage into the moat. The only thing worse than falling into a pit of spikes was falling into a pit of spikes covered in last week's rotten cabbage soup and toilet contents. In war times, defenders added animal bones to dry moats. These weren't for decoration. Broken bones could create surprisingly sharp edges. One Middle Eastern fortress reportedly filled its moat with snakes, which might just be the earliest recorded case of extreme home security. The smell from these garbage-filled moats created another defense layer. Approaching armies would smell the castle long before seeing it. In medieval times, falling into the moat wasn't just dangerous. It meant you'd need at least 3 baths before anyone would sit next to you again. Birds and rats loved these garbage moats, creating yet another problem for attackers. Imagine trying to look fierce while fighting off rats climbing up your armor. Archaeological digs at castle sites have found thousands of items in old moat beds: weapons, pottery, jewelry, and sometimes human remains. One English castle moat contained over 2,000 everyday objects, proving that medieval people threw away just as much junk as we do. Dry moats were also easier to maintain than water-filled ones. They didn't flood fields during rains or freeze solid during winter. For practical castle owners, a good garbage-filled dry moat was the medieval version of affordable home security. While these stinky moats kept enemies at a distance, the stone castle walls themselves held even more secrets. Stone corridors often created natural echo chambers that made castles into medieval surveillance systems. In many castles, whispers from one tower could travel clearly to another corner thanks to the way sound bounced off curved stone walls. Round rooms were especially tricky. Words whispered on one side could be heard perfectly on the opposite wall, but not in the middle. Castle architects were basically creating medieval wiretaps before phones even existed. These acoustic features weren't just happy accidents. Some castle builders deliberately created whispering galleries where sound traveled in surprising ways. At Bodiam Castle, the Great Hall was designed so the Lord could eavesdrop on visitors at the entrance gate. He could hear what people said about him before they knew he was listening. Medieval social media monitoring at its finest. Servants quickly figured out these sound tricks and used them for gossip gathering. The first information leaks weren't on computers. They were servants standing in the right corner of a stone hallway. Many castles had small air shafts or channels running between rooms. These were officially for ventilation, but they also carried conversations from one room to another like stone speakerphones. At Carisbrooke Castle, tiny passages connected the main meeting room to a private chamber perfect for secret listening. Smart castle dwellers developed counter-espionage techniques. They played music, ran fountains, or hung thick tapestries to break up sound waves. Others held important meetings outdoors where stone couldn't betray their words. The craftiest nobles used these acoustic tricks to spread false information. They'd stage private conversations near spots where they knew sound would travel to certain ears. Medieval fake news didn't need printing presses, just strategically placed whispers in echo-friendly corners. The phrase, "walls have ears," wasn't just a saying in medieval times. In stone castles, it was literally true. But those walls weren't just hiding sounds. Location was everything when building a castle. Good spots were usually high ground with great views that had been valued for hundreds or even thousands of years. This meant many castle builders weren't the first people to use these prime locations, and sometimes they built right on top of very old burial grounds. Building on older sacred sites wasn't just coincidence. It sent a powerful message about the new ruler taking over everything. including the important places of the past. It also saved a lot of work. Why level a new hilltop when there's already a flat area that someone else prepared? Ireland's Leap Castle sits on land that was used for ceremonies and burials long before the castle existed. During renovations in the 1900s, workers discovered an underground pit filled with countless human skeletons. This wasn't a normal burial. Many of the bones showed signs of being stabbed with spikes. The castle itself had been built directly over this mass grave. When the real estate agent said the place had lots of character, they weren't kidding. At Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, archaeologists found evidence of people living and burying their dead on the castle rock at least 3,000 years before the current castle was built. The builders of the medieval castle knew they were on old sacred ground, but built there anyway. Castle dungeons often had creepy connections to death. To save effort, castle builders would sometimes convert existing crypts or tombs into prison cells. The dungeon at Chillingham Castle was originally built as a mass grave for plague victims, then later turned into a place to hold prisoners. Talk about a room with bad energy. First you die of plague there, then they lock people up in your burial spot. Many castles had their own burial crypts right below the main floors. Glamis Castle in Scotland has an underground crypt where generations of the same family were laid to rest, with the living relatives walking and dancing on the floors directly above. At mealtimes, the dining hall would be full of noise and laughter, while just a few feet below, dozens of ancestors lay in silent tombs. Some castle chapels were built with thin walls separating the prayer area from burial chambers. The idea was that the dead could hear the prayers being said for them. A few castles even had small openings between the chapel and the crypts so that the smell of incense could reach the dead. Medieval air fresheners had a lot of work to do in those situations. Castle ghost stories often connect to these burial grounds. When Dover Castle expanded in the 1200s, workers disturbed ancient Saxon burials. According to castle records, workers refused to continue until proper reburials were arranged because they claimed to see figures walking the site at night. The medieval mind didn't separate the living world from the dead as much as we do today. Having ancestors buried nearby was seen as protection, not something creepy. Castle dwellers viewed these burials as a way to claim the power and history of a place. While human remains might have stayed quietly in the walls and under the floors, other living creatures had free run of medieval castles, some welcome and some definitely not. These medieval fortresses might have housed kings and queens, but rats ruled the spaces between walls and under floors. A single castle could house thousands of rats in its nooks and crannies. While the lord of the castle might claim to own everything inside the walls, the rats held the real majority vote. Castle kitchens were rat paradise, with food prepared in massive quantities and scraps often tossed aside. Rats enjoyed an endless buffet. Medieval rats didn't need to make restaurant reservations. They just showed up to the kitchen and seated themselves. The castle design made controlling rats nearly impossible. Stone walls had countless gaps where rats could slip through, and floors had spaces between boards where they could travel unseen. Rats basically had their own secret highway system within the walls, while humans had to use the stairs like suckers. Castle dwellers tried everything to control these pests. Cats were the most common solution, with many castles employing dozens of felines as rat hunters. Records from the Tower of London show they once had an official yeoman warder of the cats. The original pest control specialists got paid in room, board, and leftover fish heads, the medieval equivalent of an unpaid internship with free snacks. Some castles used ferrets or even kept owls inside to hunt rats that came out at night. Medieval pest control was basically assembling a tiny animal avengers team to fight rodent crime. Yet despite all these predators, the rats always won. Their ability to reproduce quickly, a single pair can have up to 2,000 descendants in 1 year, meant they couldn't be eliminated. Some castle owners paid servants for each rat tail turned in, creating a medieval bounty system. Medieval resume skills often included expert rat hunter, alongside sword polishing and banner waving. The funniest rat stories come from formal events. One French king reportedly threw his crown at a rat during his coronation dinner, missing the rat but hitting an important bishop instead. The rat escaped unharmed, while the bishop went home with a royal headache and a story nobody would believe. While rats were unwelcome visitors, castle owners sometimes voluntarily brought in even stranger animals to impress their guests. Nobles collected exotic animals to show off their wealth and power. and many of these creatures lived right inside the castle walls. Many royal castles housed lions. One fortress kept a chained bear in the courtyard. Lions, leopards, and monkeys weren't just for outdoor display. Many lived in special chambers inside castles. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep with a lion roaring in the next room. That beats having noisy neighbors with a loud TV. One royal kept a pet cheetah that roamed freely through her chambers. The castle staff lived in constant fear of turning corners, never knowing when they might face the speedy predator. Several records mention visitors refusing to stay overnight when they learned about the castle's unusual residents. Birds were especially popular castle pets. Eagles and falcons lived in special chambers called mews. Peacocks strutted around castle grounds, and their colorful feathers decorated great halls. Peacocks were cooked and refeathered before serving, purely for drama. Medieval dining involved more arts and crafts than eating. The truly rich went beyond ordinary exotic animals. Records mention a European ruler who kept a giraffe in his castle. Another royal received an elephant as a gift and built a special structure to house it. Unfortunately, the elephant died after just 2 years. Medieval Europe wasn't ideal for African wildlife. Monkeys often served as pets for noble ladies. Larger primates like baboons might be kept chained in the Great Hall as conversation pieces. One castle had a baboon that learned to mimic the castle priest's blessing movements, causing quite a scandal. Some castles even kept crocodiles in special chambers with water pools. The castle tour guide job was a lot more exciting back then. And on your left is the royal throne room, and on your right, a giant man-eating reptile from the Nile. These exotic animals needed special care. Some castles had dedicated staff just for feeding and maintaining the menagerie. Food for meat-eating animals was particularly challenging in winter, making exotic pets extremely expensive to keep. From hidden rooms to clever defenses, from ghostly burials to exotic animals, medieval castles were far more than just stone fortresses. They were complex worlds filled with surprising secrets that made them the most fascinating buildings of their time.